Hello. Hello, hello, hello. We are live. I had some issues today with Streamlabs. And I think... Oh, I'm going to have to log in on my, to the chat as well. Hold on. No, not, what does it give me this join Twitch? It should just have me log in, not... Oh, here we are. Have an account. Okay. Strange. I can't use the chat just yet. Okay, I gotta wait for the code. There it is. I got completely logged out of Streamlabs. Alright, there we go. Hey, Moogle. Okay, and I got the emote only off. So I had used my streaming software earlier to record some gameplay, and it was fine. Everything was fine. This was just only a few hours ago, and when I brought it up, it was like a first-time setup thing. It didn't see the webcam. I had to log in, and then everything was like this, like portrait mode instead of landscape mode, and it took me a little bit to fix everything, to get it to detect the webcam again. But we're here. Moogle, I'm a little behind, and you're a moderator. So could you do me a favor and type a message into the chat stating that today's stream is a PG-rated stream and no adult language for today, and then pin it to the top of the chat. And when it asks you for the pin duration, there's like an icon that says until the end of the stream, or manually. Because I'm a little behind here. I'm still trying to get all my ducks in a row, and the act of bringing up the streaming software and recording the promo and going live is usually a very quick one, but it was a lot slower today, and I'm hoping this is not going to be a thing that happens too often. Alright, here. Thank you, Moogle. Yeah, that worked perfectly. That's exactly what I needed. I've never had anything like that happen. I mean, I've had it where I was logged out for whatever reason. Usually there was an update to either Streamlabs or Windows or Twitch itself or something like that. But this was unusual. This was, not only was I logged out, but it couldn't see the webcam. I had to unplug it and plug it back in and get it to detect it again, and it changed my canvas. Now I have to, before we start anything, I have to navigate over to my own stream and make sure the output is correct, that it looks right. So let's see if we could see what's going on there. Where am I? Here I am. To find my own channel. All right. It looks right. Okay, yeah, no, it looks good. It looks exactly the way it should. Alright. Well, welcome into another stream, guys. I'm sorry for the very strange sort of intro here, but like I said, it put me a little behind schedule. Thankfully, I have Moogle here to help me out. Let me go ahead and get the word out to various places that we're online. Oh, can I do it on this Discord? Is there like a place for that? Promotions, okay. Okay. Oh, but it's like a thread? Why can't I post it? Oh. No. What? Oh, that's just the title. Gotcha. Okay, there we go. All right, there we go. I'm in the Lord of the Rings based meme Discord now, so I thought I'd post there. So, how are you? How are you today, Moogle? So I normally ask you that first, but it was all business. Okay, let me head over to social media. Doing good. All right, good to hear that. I've been looking forward to this for a while. I always enjoy the reading streams, although they are hell on my voice. They really are. It makes me realize that when I stream video games, I'm not talking the entire time. There's moments where I'm not talking, you know what I mean? I'm talking most of the time, but not all of the time. But today, we're, you know, at these sort of streams, when I do the podcast streams with Matt and Sid, I'm not talking all of the time, because there's times that Matt is talking or that Sid is talking. But for reading streams, it's a lot of talking, and usually I'm feeling very tired, and my throat is kind of achy afterwards, but apparently my streamiversary is coming up. I guess that's interesting in a way. Be free away. Did I post on Twitter? Yes, I did. Let me send a message to Laurel. She doesn't like to miss these. Okay, there we go. And I already pre-promoted on Quora, so there's that as well. So there we have it. Okay, yeah, we're good, I think. It's so strange because I had been using Streamlabs earlier in the day to record Pokemon videos, and it worked fine. Well, I have extra water, and where's my book? Very important to have the book. Here it is. This is what we'll be reading today. The Fellowship of the Ring being the first part of the Lord of the Rings. Now, Moogle, because you've been at every one of these, and I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned to me sort of at the beginning, like, you know, we had done The Hobbit already, but you mentioned to me that you had never read through The Lord of the Rings, and so this is sort of your way of experiencing it in this format is a little different, obviously, but what do you think so far? Because obviously I know, like, you've probably seen the films, and we've all seen the films like a million times, right? But the book is a bit different, obviously. It's its own thing. It's just the movies are their own thing. Oh, you have read it before? But I had thought that you told me that you had not read it all the way through. That was the impression I got. I could be mistaken on that. How old were you when you read it? Did you know I did a book report on The Lord of the Rings once? Oh, what grade was I in? It was junior high school. 12 or 13, yeah. Well, I was around 7 or 8 when I first read The Hobbit. But I think when I first read The Lord of the Rings, I must have been around 11 years old. Possibly I was 12, but I think I was 11 years old. And when I was in junior high school, I did a book report on The Lord of the Rings. And it was interesting because I didn't do a book report on Fellowship of the Ring, or The Two Towers, or The Return of the King. I did the entirety of it because it really is just one, you know, thing. And I remember I drew pictures too. Like, it was the only time that I really cared about a book report. I don't know. I wonder, do children still do book reports? I'm curious to know if anybody has children in school, or maybe I should just ask my nephews. I'm going to text one of my nephews right now. I'm gonna text Bobby and ask him if kids in school, 'cause he's in high school, still do book reports. Where is he? There he is. Do kids still do book? Because it just seems bizarre. Like, obviously having the assignment of reading a specific book, I understand that. Right. Having an assignment to read a book is interesting because, you know, a lot of times they wouldn't assign you a book. You would just have to pick something and then write a report on it, you know? And, it's just, you know, and I never really understood book reports, I think, as a kid. I always thought, like, am I writing a review? You know, like, what am I doing exactly, you know? And when I did The Lord of the Rings as a book report, that was the only time that I understood the assignment. I knew exactly what I was going to do. Well, I wouldn't say that I understood the assignment because I still don't understand, you know, what exactly you're expected to do in a book report. Like, because the kids would just come up and they would stand in front of the class and they would say what the book was, who wrote it, what it was about, and then what they thought of it, which to me is a review. And then that was it. And then the teacher would give them a grade. I don't know what the grade was based on, right? You know, and it was weird because you had to write the book report and, like, present it, which was weird, right? So you're graded on not only writing the report, but presenting it. But I remember, I think I was in the 7th grade, and I did The Lord of the Rings. And I got a good grade. I don't remember what it was. It was like a 90 somewhat, you know. And but what was interesting, though, because the teacher said to me, you know, The Lord of the Rings, it's like 3 books. That's pretty impressive that you managed to get that done in such a short amount of time. And I just did this. And because I didn't want to say anything, because I didn't want to lie, is that it's not that I had read the entirety, the 1,200 pages of The Lord of the Rings in such a short period of time, but that I had read it so many times that I knew it. You know what I mean? That I didn't need to read it again, you know? So, yeah. Like I said, I first read The Lord of the Rings when I was around 11 years old. And when I did that book report, I guess that was shortly after I was 12, but I'd already read through it a few times, you know? And it wasn't too far after that when I read Unfinished Tales. I think when I first read Unfinished Tales, I must have been about Bobby's age. I must have been about 14. Yeah. Bobby's about to turn 14. But yeah, I texted him. I don't know if kids still do book reports. I remember I had to help him with an assignment a couple of years ago where he had to read a book. I don't know what he had to do, if he had to take a test or do a report or anything. I just know he was having a hard time getting through this book because he found it to be incredibly dull. It's not that he finds reading to be incredibly dull. He just was not invested in this book at all. And what was interesting was that when I was, because he wanted us to read it to him, and then maybe that would help him a bit, and my mother read some of it to him, but I found that to be hard to deal with because she was so monotonous and didn't put any sort of performance into it, you know? And I said, you're boring him even more, you know? And she says, you do it. And so I did it in my style, you know? And I actually found it to be a little compelling. It was about the sort of Oregon Trail. I don't remember the name of the book, but it was some sort of like Oregon Trail story of pioneers going across the United States in its infancy. And, I thought it was interesting, and he thought it was the most boring thing ever. And I said, we had a little bit of action and, a little bit of danger and stuff happened. It's like I said, there's a lot more... No, it wasn't that. I would have recognized that. It was about this boy, and I guess his parents had died, and he had sort of become adopted by the people in the wagon train that were going to I don't know where they were going, but somewhere out west. And and it was sort of a coming of age story, I guess, really. I don't remember, but I read like the last 3 chapters to him, and then he was done, and he was so glad to be done with it. And I said, there's a lot worse books out there. There really are. There's so many books out there that will bore you into a coma, really. You'll go right into a coma. But he thought this was the dullest thing ever, and he would rather have been reading one of those sort of Japanese comic books, but which I think anything that if you're reading, you're as a kid you're doing good, though. Like it could be a manga, or it could be anything, really. I don't care if a kid is reading Spider-Man, he's still reading. I had one teacher that understood the assignment. She understood that kids should be that they should be encouraged to read, but there shouldn't be any sort of gatekeeping involved in it. Like, because I would have a lot of teachers that would say, well, you need to read something, but there was so many criteria. It had to be approved. It had to be, this and that. And this teacher was she had like sort of the reading rainbow approach of, you should enjoy reading. So pick what you like. I don't care what it is, just read it. And that was when I first read The Hobbit, because I was reading a lot of science fiction, and my mother gave me a copy of The Hobbit. I was the 3rd grade. Yeah, I just wonder about book reports, if children still do book reports, See, the thing is, I don't see something like The Lord of the Rings. I don't think it would hold Bobby's attention. Not because it's too difficult or anything like that, but I think it's just, I don't think he's so much into fantasy unless it's like something with ninjas and high school students, that kind of thing. He's very in the anime sort of aesthetic, And it's even interesting is that, like, when he was first into anime, I have this book that I don't know if you can see it back there. Hold on, maybe if I blow it up a little. I want to go to the full screen webcam here. Yeah, it's right there, and it's a book that Alice got me that is it's Dragon Quest's art. It's the art of Dragon Quest. So it's got a lot of Akira Toriyama's artwork and notes on Dragon Quest and such. And Bobby doesn't know much about Dragon Quest. It's not his kind of video game, but I thought he would find the book interesting because it's a lot of art in an anime style, and it's the same artist that had done, Dragon Ball and it was interesting because he's so into anime, and he had never heard of Akira Toriyama. He had never heard of Dragon Ball. He didn't know what any of it was. It to him, like, it's just the stuff like that's on like Cartoon Network or whatever he's watching that is very different. It's all this. There's this manga that I forget what it's called. It's something about a high school of assassins or something like that. That he's very into that, and I guess there was an anime made out of it. And to him, that's what anime is. It's so the stuff that we knew when we were young. That's old people junk, that sort of thing. You know what? I should. He hasn't answered me, but I should text my other nephew as well. No, actually, it looks like... No, he didn't answer me. That was from Twitch. Yeah, I'm not going to bother. But yeah, I just wonder... I don't know that The Lord of the Rings would hold his attention, but, maybe the movies. But even then, they're very, very long, and it's not the sort of thing that he's normally into, fantasy stuff, Ranma Half... No, okay, so I'm not an anime person. But I believe the idea there is that he gets wet and turns into a girl, and then if she gets wet, she turns into him. But I think it's like a hot water, cold water thing, and that it's mostly a comedy sort of thing. Am I correct in that it's supposed to be just really mostly gags? I don't think he would Maybe Nathan would like that, right? Like, Nathan would think it was amusing. But, yeah, not so much. Bobby would it needs to have action and high school drama sort of thing, you know? But anyway, yeah, I always wonder, like, if you showed them The Lord of the Rings, I think Nathan would be really into it, you know? And he's certainly old enough. Maybe I need to expose him to... he's not a big reader, but maybe I can get him to watch the films, you know? Sit him down and watch The Fellowship of the Ring and see what he thinks of it, you know? But Nathan's an interesting kid because his interests change so often, you know? Well, I mean, all kids do that, right? All kids go through the different stages where they're really into something for a little while, and then it's like, oh, you know, I don't like that anymore, you know? And it's like, no, this is news to me, actually, you know? All of a sudden, it's lame, you know? But anyway, guys, we are going to be reading The Fellowship of the Ring, and I welcome in anybody who's watching, anybody who may be lurking, anybody who may be watching this on YouTube. And this is the last time that we're going to be doing one of these streams exclusively on Twitch. Because we reached 2,000 subscribers on YouTube. And I had said that once we reach 2,000 subscribers on YouTube, I will start multi-streaming. So the next time that I do a Tolkien stream, which should be, I'll tell you in a moment, February the 6th, where I'll have Matt and Sid with me, we will be streaming to Twitch as normal, but also to YouTube simultaneously, which I have to do some stuff on my end to get that to happen, obviously. But also, I'm going to need moderators on the YouTube side of things. So I'm going to put a call out on the Discord for people that want to be YouTube moderators, who want to be there. They don't necessarily have to be Twitch moderators. Actually, it would be best if we had some people on Twitch and some people on YouTube moderating, and, you know, I don't know what the traffic will be like on YouTube, but, you know, it's a pretty big base of people there, and they're exclusively, into this for the Tolkien thing. They're not coming to the, the gaming streams and whatnot. So, it's going to be a very, very different crowd of people, obviously. Yeah. I'll put a call out on the Discord and see who is interested in moderating on the YouTube side and whatnot. Oh, he just texted me. Where's my phone? That's my nephew. He says they do still do book reports, just not as much, only like 3 a year. Well, that sounds like what we would do, right? It wouldn't be like all the time. Right, Moogle? I know you're of a similar age bracket to me. It's I don't remember doing more than 3 a year for book reports. Sometimes it would be 2. Yeah, that sounds about right. Okay, guys, let's get started. We're gonna get rid of the music. And we're gonna come over to here. So welcome in, everybody. So we are starting the Fellowship of the Ring here on the, I want to say, 11th chapter, I want to say. Oh, 12th, I was close. The 12th chapter, which is called Flight to the Ford, which is chapter 209, in my copy at least. And the reason that I... Well, let me not get into that yet. Let's start with a bit of a recap. So obviously, we're a little bit, very close to halfway through here. Frodo Baggins, our main hero here, our protagonist, I should say, has inherited the One Ring. from his older cousin Bilbo, and 17 years have passed, and he has found out that the ring that he has is the One Ring, and that it is dangerous, and that Sauron, the Lord of the Rings, is after him now. So he has been running from danger while simultaneously running into danger along with his friends Sam and Merry and Pippin. They had some misadventures in the Shire. They got lost in the old forest. They met Tom Bombadil, and they wound up in a town called Bree. And in Bree, they met a man who calls himself Strider, and he is to be their guide. And of course, his real name is Aragorn, son of Arathorn. And he has led them into the wild, and at a place called Imonsul, which means Weathertop, they have run afoul of the Black Riders, the Ring Wraiths, the Nazgul. And Frodo put on the ring, and he was able to see them clearly, and the leader of the Nazgul, the Witch King, stabbed him. So he's wounded, and that is where we left off, where he passed out from the wound. So Chapter 12, Flight to the Ford. When Frodo came to himself, he was still clutching the ring desperately. He was lying by the fire, which was now piled high and burning brightly. His 3 companions were bending over him. "What has happened? Where is the Pale King?" he asked wildly. They were too overjoyed to hear him speak to answer for a while, nor did they understand his question. At length he gathered from Sam that they had seen nothing but the vague, shadowy shapes coming toward them. Suddenly, to his horror, Sam found that his master had vanished, and at that moment a black shadow rushed past him, and he fell. He heard Frodo's voice, but it seemed to come from a great distance, or from under the earth, crying out strange words. They saw nothing more until they stumbled over the body of Frodo, lying as if dead, face downwards on the grass with his sword beneath him. Strider ordered them to pick him up and lay him near the fire, and then he disappeared. That was now a good while ago. Sam plainly was beginning to have doubts again about Strider. But while they were talking, he returned, appearing suddenly out of the shadows. They started, and Sam drew his sword and stood over Frodo, but Strider knelt down swiftly at his side. "I am not a Black Rider, Sam," he said gently, "nor in league with them. I have been trying to discover something of their movements, but I have found nothing. I cannot think why they have gone and do not attack again. But there is no feeling of their presence anywhere at hand." When he heard what Frodo had to tell, he became full of concern, and shook his head and sighed. Then he ordered Pippin and Merry to heat as much water as they could in their small kettles, and to bathe the wound with it. "Keep the fire going well, and keep Frodo warm," he said. Then he got up and walked away, and called Sam to him. "I think I understand things better now," he said in a low voice. "There seem only to have been 5 of the enemy. Why they were not all here I don't know, but I don't think they expected to be resisted. They have drawn off for the time being, but not far, I fear. They will come again after night if we cannot escape. They are only waiting because they think that their purpose is almost accomplished, and that the ring cannot fly much further. I fear, Sam, that they believe your master has a deadly wound that will subdue him to their will. We shall see." Sam choked with fears. "Don't despair," said Strider. "You must trust me now. Your Frodo is made of sterner stuff than I had guessed, though Gandalf hinted that it might prove so. He is not slain, and I think he will resist the evil power of the wound longer than his enemies expect. I will do all I can to help and heal him. Guard him well while I am away." He hurried off and disappeared again into the darkness. I have to pause here. Mostly because I had to sneeze, but I also do have comments here. So, we're about to get our first look at Aragorn as the healer. So far, we know him as the ranger, without really much information given on what a ranger actually is, and we sort of find out throughout the book what a ranger is and what a ranger does. He's in many things. He wears many hats, as they say. And in this case, he is wearing the hat of a healer, while also wearing the hat of a guide and an outdoorsman and such. So, a lot of people, when they think of the character of Aragorn, their first thought is of a warrior, and that is not not incorrect. It is completely correct to think of him as a warrior, but it's a limited view of what he is. He's a lot of things. He's a warrior, he's a healer, he's a king, he's a poet, he's a minstrel, he's a friend, he is a ranger, of course, an outdoorsman, and quite a many other things. They don't even really understand who they're dealing with at this point, because to Sam especially, he's just this sort of scruffy guy that they picked up along the way, who he doesn't entirely trust, and he doesn't really know of all his abilities and all of his many hats that he wears, so to speak. I have to sneeze again, and I'm waiting for it to... Stuck. Now, Aragorn here wonders at why there are only 5 of the ring wraiths. We know that there should be 9, because there were 9 rings that were given to men by Sauron. So 9 ring wraiths. And they actually already split up, because some people wonder, how did they even get into the Shire? Now, at the surface level, first pass reading through, you would say, well, the Shire does not have much of security. There's no gate, really. You could just walk right in. They may not really care for outsiders being there all that much, but they don't really do anything to stop them from coming in. The only barrier that they have is that wall on the western border of the Shire, but that was mostly to keep the old forest from creeping in, not from keeping men or elves or dwarves or whoever from coming in. And that's only one side. People wouldn't be coming in from the west or even the south. They would be coming in from the east. And there's nothing stopping them. There's a major road that runs right into the Shire. There's no sort of toll or barricade or anything like that. But so that on surface level, a person reading The Lord of the Rings for the first time, they wouldn't really wonder too much about how they got in. But then when you learn more about the lore, and you know that the Rangers were there, thank you for the follow, protecting the Shire, and they were doing it at Aragorn's behest, you might wonder, how exactly did the Ringwraiths get into the Shire? And this is actually answered in the appendix. And what happened was, they basically split up, and some of the Ringwraiths fought the Rangers at a place called Sanfor, and some of them got in, because the ones that were fighting the Rangers drew the Rangers away, the Dunedain. Aragorn wasn't with them at that point, because he was helping Gandalf by waiting for Frodo. But the Ringwraiths got in, not all of them, and that's why they're split up. We haven't seen them all coalesce into one force yet. We haven't seen all 9 of them come together. That will happen. Let's continue. Frodo dozed, though the pain of his wound was slowly growing and a deadly chill was spreading from his shoulder to his arm and side. His friends watched over him, warming him and bathing his wound. The night passed slowly and warily. Dawn was growing in the sky, and the dell was filling with grey light when Strider at last returned. "Look," he cried, and stooping he lifted from the ground a black cloak that had lain there hidden by the darkness. A foot above the lower hem there was a slash. "This was the stroke of Frodo's sword," he said, "the only hurt that it did to his enemy. I fear, for it is unharmed, but all blades perish that pierced that dreadful king. More deadly to him was the name of Elbereth. And more deadly to Frodo was this." He stooped again and lifted up a long, thin knife. There was a cold gleam in it. As Strider raised it, they saw that near the end, its edge was notched, and the point was broken off. But even as he held it up in the growing light, they gazed in astonishment, for the blade seemed to melt, and vanished like smoke in the air, leaving only the hilt in Strider's hand. "Alas," he cried, "it was this accursed knife that gave him the wound. Few now have the skill in healing to match such evil weapons, but I will do what I can." He sat down on the ground, and taking the dagger hilt, laid it on his knees, and he sang over it a slow song in a strange tongue. Then, setting it aside, he turned to Frodo, and in a soft tone spoke words that others could not catch. From the pouch at his belt he drew out the long leaves of a plant. "These leaves," he said, "I have walked far to find, for yet this plant does not grow in the bare hills, but in the thickets away south of the road. I found it in the dark by the scent of its leaves." He crushed a leaf in his fingers, and it gave off a sweet and pungent fragrance. "It is fortunate that I could find it, for it is as a healing plant that men of the West brought to Middle-earth. Athelas they named it, and it grows now sparsely and only near places where they dwelled or camped of old, and it is not known in the north except to some of those who wander in the wild. It has great virtues, but over such a wound as this its healing powers may be small." He threw the leaves into boiling water and bathed Frodo's shoulder. The fragrance of the steam was refreshing, and those that were unhurt felt their minds calmed and cleared. The herb also had some power over the wound, for Frodo felt the pain, and also the sense of frozen cold lessen in his side. But the life did not return to his arm, and he could not raise or use his hand. He bitterly regretted his foolishness, and reproached himself for weakness of will. For he now perceived that in putting on the ring he obeyed not his own desire, but the commanding wish of his enemies. He wondered if he would remain maimed for life, and how they would now manage to continue their journey. He felt too weak to stand. So pause briefly, just to comment on something that Aragorn here said. He said, men of the West brought it to Middle-earth. Now, usually when Tolkien says the West with a capital W, he's speaking of the Undying Lands, Aemon, Tol Eressëa, places like that. But when Aragorn says it, he's talking about Númenor, and it's not really inaccurate to say that that's the West, because it is the West. It's not only that it was to the west of Middle-earth, but it was close enough to the Undying Lands that on a very clear day they could see Tol Eressëa. And Númenor comes from the word Númen, which means west. And sometimes you'll hear him and other characters refer to it as Westerness, or the land that was, Atalanta. Númenor, of course, I mentioned that, and it had another name that's relevant to the Lord of the Rings. I'm trying to think of it now. It's Atalanta, Westerness, Númenor, the land that was... Oh, Akalabeth. And Akalabeth means downfall. So usually it refers to the actual destruction of Númenor was the Akalabeth, but also calling the land Akalabeth also refers to it as the downfallen. It's also sometimes referred to as Avalone, which I think is really more of a reference to the peaks of Númenor. But here we go. Okay, we're going to continue here. The others were discussing this very question. They quickly decided to leave Weathertop as soon as possible. "I think now," said Strider, "that the enemy has been watching this place for some days. If Gandalf ever came here, then he must have been forced to ride away, and he will not return. In any case, we are in great peril here after dark, since the attack of last night, and we can hardly meet greater danger wherever we go." As soon as daylight was full, they had some hurried food and packed. It was impossible for Frodo to walk, so they divided the greater part of their luggage among the four of them, and put Frodo on the pony. In the last few days, the poor beast had improved wonderfully. It already seemed fatter and stronger, and had begun to show an affection for its new masters, especially for Sam. Bill Ferny's treatment must have been very hard for the journey in the wild to seem so much better than its former life. They started off in a southerly direction. This would mean crossing the road, but it was the quickest way to more wooded country. And they needed fuel, for Strider said that Frodo must be kept warm, especially at night, while fire would be some protection for them all. It was also his plan to shorten their journey by cutting across another great loop of the road, east beyond Weathertop. It changed its course and took a wide bend northwards. They made their way slowly and cautiously round the southwestern slopes of the hill, and came in a little while to the edge of the road. There was no sign of the riders, but even as they were hurrying across they heard far away two cries, a cold voice calling, and a cold voice answering. Trembling, they sprang forward, and made for the thickets that lay ahead. The land before them sloped away southward, but it was wild and pathless. Bushes and stunted trees grew in dense patches with wide barren spaces in between. The grass was scanty, coarse, and grey, and the leaves in the thickets were faded and falling. It was a cheerless land, and their journey was slow and gloomy. They spoke little as they trudged along. Frodo's heart was grieved as he watched them walking beside him with their heads down, and their backs bowed under their burdens. Even Strider seemed tired and heavy-hearted. Before the day's first march was over, Frodo's pain began to grow again, but he did not speak of it for a long time. 4 days passed without the ground or the scene changing much, except that behind them weathertops slowly sank, and before them the distant mountains loomed a little nearer. Yet since that far cry they had seen and heard no sign that the enemy had marked their flight or followed them. They dreaded the dark hours, and kept watch in pairs by night, expecting at any time to see black shapes stalking in the grey night, dimly lit by the cloud-veiled moon. But they saw nothing and heard no sound but the sigh of withered leaves and grass. Not once did they feel the sense of present evil that had assailed them before the attack in the dell. It seemed too much to hope that the riders had already lost their trail again. Perhaps they were waiting to make some ambush in a narrow place. At the end of the 5th day, the ground began once more to rise slowly out of the wide, shallow valley in which they had descended. Strider now turned their course again northeastward, and on the 6th day they reached the top of a long, slow-climbing slope, and saw far ahead a huddle of wooded hills. Away below them they could see the roads sweeping round the feet of the hills, and to their right a grey river gleamed, pale in the thin sunshine. In the distance they glimpsed yet another river in a stony valley half-veiled in mist. "I am afraid we must go back to the road here for a while," said Strider. "We have now come to the river Horwell, that the elves call Mithilfell. It flows down of the Ettenmoors, the Troll Fells north of Rivendell, and joins the Loudwater away in the south. Some call it the Grey Flood after that. It is a great water before it finds the sea. There is no way over it below its sources in the Ettenmoors, except by the last bridge on which the road crosses." "What is that other river we can see far away there?" said Merry. "That is Loudwater, the Bruinen of Rivendell," answered Strider. "The road runs along the edge of the hills for many miles, from the bridge to the ford of Bruinen, but I have not yet thought how we shall cross that water. One river at a time. We shall be fortunate indeed if we do not find the last bridge held against us." So to pause here, so we get our first mention of the ford of Bruinen, where a very climactic thing happens, and it's also interesting. The elves call, he calls it Horwell, this one river, and he says that the elves call it Mithilfell, and then he translates that to Grey Flood, and of course myth is the Sindarin word that means grey, and we see it in things like mithril, with ril meaning brilliance. So it's a way of calling it silver, brilliant grey. Of course, mithril and silver are not exactly the same thing, but in Tolkien's world, there's silver, and then there's true silver. And we see this a lot with myth, meaning grey. The other thing to mention about this is comparison to the films. In the Fellowship of the Ring film version, we get the scene at Weathertop that happens more or less the same way as in the book. Aragorn's not quite as smart as he was in the book, but the same sequence of events basically happens where they're ambushed by the ring wraiths and Frodo gets stabbed, and then it seems like there's a mad dash that happens all in the space of maybe a day or so. They go into the Athelas, which is also called Kingsfoil, but then it seems almost immediately Arwen appears and sort of scoops Frodo up like a football and carries him almost all the way to Rivendell. And I have said in the movie that Arwen is taking on the role of several other characters. A lot of people will point out Glorfindel, because we're about to meet Glorfindel pretty soon. He's the elf that appears here in the book, not Arwen. but also Elrond and Gandalf, and a little bit of Aragorn too, because as we see, they've already been traveling for 6 days. So it's not like Frodo got stabbed and then Arwen just appears, or Glorfindel appears, or if you're watching the Ralph Bakshi animated version from the 70s, Legolas suddenly appears and scoops him up and takes him the rest of the way. Aragorn is doing most of the heavy lifting here, and even there's a point, which we're about to see, where Frodo sort of recovers a little bit and is able to walk a little bit. He's not quite as... I mean, the situation is dire, but he's a lot stronger in the book. He doesn't sort of just flop over so many times and let other people carry him around. At once they went on again. They crossed the bridge in safety, hearing no sound but the water swirling against its three great arches. A mile further on, they came into a narrow ravine that led away northwards through the steep lands on the left of the road. Here Strider turned aside, and soon they were lost in a sombre country of dark trees winding among the feet of the sullen hills. The hobbits were glad to leave the cheerless lands and the perilous road behind them, but this new country seemed threatening and unfriendly. As they went forward, the hills about them steadily rose. Here and there upon heights and ridges they caught glimpses of ancient walls of stone, and the ruins of towers. They had an ominous look. Frodo, who was not walking, had time to gaze ahead and to think. He recalled Bilbo's account of his journey in the threatening towers on the hills north of the road, in the country near the Troll's Wood, where his first serious adventure had happened. Frodo guessed that they were now in the same region, and wondered if by chance they would pass near the spot. "Who lives in this land?" he asked. "And who built these towers? Is this troll country?" "No," said Strider. "Trolls do not build. No one lives in this land. Men once dwelt here ages ago, but none remain now. They became an evil people, as legend tells, for they fell under the shadow of Angmar. But all were destroyed in the war that brought the North Kingdom to its end. But that is now so long ago that the hills have forgotten them, though a shadow still lies on the land." "Where did you learn such tales if all the land is empty and forgetful?" asked Peregrine. "The birds and beasts do not tell tales of that sort." "The heirs of Elendil do not forget all things past," said Strider, "and many more things that I can tell are remembered in Rivendell." "Have you often been to Rivendell?" said Frodo. "I have," said Strider. "I dwelt there once, and still I return when I may. There my heart is. But it is not my fate to sit in peace, even in the fair house of Elrond." Let's pause here and give a little background for Aragorn. So he mentions that he lived in Rivendell, and of course a lot of the information about Aragorn and his past is actually in the appendix, or some other works as well. But of course, we know that he is, as he mentioned, an heir of Elendil. Elendil was once the High King of a vast kingdom that were basically the remnant of Numenor. And they had come to Middle-earth, and they had founded this kingdom that took a large portion of Middle-earth, or at least the portion of Middle-earth that represents Europe, that became their kingdom, the kingdom of men. And after Elendil died in the war against Sauron, the realm became split into two regions. In the north, it was called Arnor. In the south, Gondor. And then Arnor, in the northern kingdom, further split into three different smaller kingdoms. I mentioned this, I think, two streams ago. Arthedain, Rhudaur, and Cardolan. And basically, the Arthedain line is where Aragorn comes from. And of course, because one of the kings of Arthedain had married a Gondorian princess, it sort of coalesced Isildur's line and Anarian's line, they were two of Elendil's sons, into one, and that's why he's not only descended from Elendil, but both of his sons, Isildur and Anarion, making him the rightful king of not only of Gondor, but of Arnor as well. But what's interesting about this, though, is that at some point, the line of the kings of Rhudaur failed, the line of the kings of Cardolan failed, leaving the king of Arthedain as the last remnant of this. And eventually, they decided that because Arnor was so diminished, and because there were no longer kings in these other regions, that they might as well give up the idea of the kingdom of Arthedain. And the next in line after the last king of Arthedain became the first chieftain of the Dunedain. And Dunedain is a word that means men of the West, so essentially Númenorian men that live in Middle-earth are called Dunedain. So Aragorn is of this line of chieftains of the Dunedain. And this is why, he's looking after all of these lands, not just Arthedain, but also Rhudaur and Cardolan. And he has been to the south, and he has served in the armies of Gondor and Rohan, although he did it under an assumed name. He called himself Thorongil. But the interesting part is the connection to Rivendell, because when Aragorn was only 2 years old, his father died. His father was a man named Arathorn. And he died, and his mother was a woman named Gilrain. Now, there was a tradition that the chieftains of the Dunedain would be fostered by Lord Elrond. And what's really interesting is that every one of these chieftains of the Dunedain, you can trace their lineage back to Isildur and Anarion, to Elendil, and then further back all the way to Elros, the first king of Númenor. And his brother was Elrond. So it's sort of their great-great-great-great-great-uncle sort of situation. But because his father had died, he came to live at Rivendell, and basically Elrond becomes his adopted father. And Gilrain, his mother, was there. She has since passed on. But he didn't know anything about any of this. They called him Estel, which is an Elvish word that means hope. And he didn't know his real name until he was about 20 years old. He found out that his real name was Aragorn, and that he was the heir of Elendil, and that he could, one day become the king. And it's around the same time that he met Arwen and fell in love with her. And some people ask me, well, how did he only meet Arwen when he was 20 years old? If he was been living there for 18 years. She actually didn't live in Rivendell. She lived in Lothlorien with her grandparents, and would only come, once every few decades or so to visit her father in Rivendell. You think Arwen's 3,000 years old. She doesn't need to be hanging around with her dad all the time. But okay, let's continue. The hills now began to shut them in. The road behind held its way to the river Bruinen, but both were now hidden from view. The travelers came into a long valley, narrow, deeply cloven, dark and silent. Trees with old and twisted roots hung over cliffs and piled up behind the mounting slopes of pinewood. The hobbits grew very weary. They advanced slowly, for they had to pick their way through a pathless country, encumbered by fallen trees and tumbled rocks. As soon as they could, they avoided climbing for Frodo's sake, and because it was in fact difficult to find any way up out of the narrow dales. They had been 2 days in this country when the weather turned wet. The wind began to blow steadily out of the west, and pour the water of the distant seas in the dark heads of the hill in fine drenching rain. By nightfall they were all soaked, and their camp was cheerless, for they could not get any fire to burn. The next day the hills rose still higher and steeper before them, and they were forced to turn away northward out of their course. Strider seemed to be getting anxious. They were nearly 10 days out from Weathertop, and their stock of provisions was beginning to run low. It went on raining. That night they camped on a stony shelf with a rock wall behind them, in which there was a shallow cave, a mere scoop in the cliff. Frodo was restless. The cold and wet had made his wound more painful than ever, and the ache and sense of deadly chill took away all sleep. He lay tossing and turning and listening fearfully to the steady night noises. Wind in chinks of rock, water dripping, a crack, the sudden rattling fall of a loosened stone. He felt that the black shapes were advancing to smother him, but when he sat up he saw nothing but the back of Strider, sitting hunched up, smoking his pipe and watching. He lay down again, and passed into an uneasy dream, in which he walked on the grass in his garden in the Shire.
but it seemed faint and dim, less clear than the tall black shadows that stood looking over the ledge. In the morning, he woke to find that the rain had stopped. The clouds were still thick, but they were breaking, and pale strips of blue appeared between them. The wind was shifting again. They did not start early. Immediately after their cold and comfortless breakfast, Strider went off alone, telling the others to remain under the shelter of the cliff until he came back. He was going to climb up if he could and get a good look at the lie of the land. When he returned, he was not reassuring. "We have come too far to the north," he said, "and we must find some way to turn back southwards again. If we keep going as we are going, we shall get up into the Etendales, far north of Rivendell. That is troll country and little known to me. We could perhaps find our way through and come round to Rivendell from the north, but it would take too long, for I do not know the way, and our food would not last. So somehow or other we must find the ford of Bruinen." The rest of that day they spent scrambling over rocky ground. They found a passage between two hills that led them into a valley running southeast, the direction that they wished to take, but toward the end of the day they found their road again barred by a ridge of high land. Its dark edge against the sky was broken into many bare points, like teeth of a blunted saw. They had a choice between going back or climbing over it. They decided to attempt the climb, but it proved very difficult. Before long, Frodo was obliged to dismount and struggle along on foot. Even so, they often despaired of getting their pony up, or indeed of finding a path for themselves, burdened as they were. The light was nearly gone, and they were all exhausted when at last they reached the top. They had climbed up to a narrow saddle between two higher points, and the land fell steeply away again, only a short distance ahead. Frodo threw himself down and lay on the ground shivering. His left arm was lifeless, and his side and shoulder felt as if icy claws were laid upon them. The trees and rocks about him seemed shadowy and dim. "We cannot go any further," said Merry to Strider. "I am afraid that this has been too much for Frodo. I am dreadfully anxious about him. What are we to do? Do you think they will be able to cure him in Rivendell if we ever get there?" "We shall see," answered Strider. "There is nothing more that I can do in the wilderness, and it is chiefly because of his wound that I am anxious to press on. But I agree that we can go no further tonight." "What is the matter with my master?" asked Sam in a low voice, looking appealingly at Strider. "His wound was small, and it is already closed. There is nothing to be seen but a cold white mark on his shoulder." "Frodo has been touched by the weapons of the enemy," said Strider. "And there is some poison or evil at work that is beyond my skill to drive out. But do not give up hope, Sam." Night was cold up on the high ridge. They lit a small fire down under the gnarled roots of an old pine that hung over a shallow pit. It looked as if stone had once been quarried there. They sat huddled together. The wind blew chill across the pass, and they heard the tree-tops lower down moaning and sighing. Frodo lay in half a dream, imagining that endless dark wings were sweeping by above him, and that on the wings rode pursuers that sought him in all the hollows of the hills. Now, I do want to pause here for a moment and speak about Frodo's dream. We've stopped a few times to talk specifically about Frodo having prophetic dreams. Hi, Alice. He had a prophetic dream when they were still in the Shire about climbing a tower and seeing the sea, and I mentioned about how this is sort of a representation of his eventual fate of sailing to the west. He had a prophetic dream when he was in Tom Bombadil's house, and he saw Gandalf stuck on Orthanc and then being carried away by an eagle. And now he's having another prophetic dream of the Black Riders, the Ringwraiths, flying. There has been no hint of this as of yet. They have rode on horses so far. But if you've read through this before, or if you've seen the films, or some of the artwork, or whatever, you know that eventually they are going to sort of upgrade from horses to these creatures that most people refer to them as fell beasts, although that's more of a description than a name. Tolkien called them Nazgul birds. In the film version, they were sort of more draconian. They looked like little tiny dragons. A lot of people have compared them to pterodactyls, and Tolkien was quite amused by this. In one of his letters, he wrote that he wasn't thinking of that sort of thing when he wrote about it, but certainly that a pterodactyl or a pterodon is a very accurate representation of what the Nazgul birds, the fell beasts, would look like. that Frodo here again having a prophetic dream. The morning dawned bright and fair. The air was clean, and the light pale and clear in a rain-washed sky. Their hearts were encouraged, but they longed for the sun to warm their cold, stiff limbs. As soon as it was bright, Strider took Merry with him, and went to survey the country from the height of the east of the pass. The sun had risen and was shining brightly when he returned with more comforting news. They were now going more or less in the right direction. If they went on down the further side of the ridge, they would have the mountains on their left. Some way ahead, Strider had caught a glimpse of the Loudwater again, and he knew that, though it was hidden from view, the road to the ford was not far from the river, and lay on the side nearest to them. "We must make for the road again," he said. "We cannot hope to find a path through these hills. Whatever danger may beset it, the road is our only way to the ford." As soon as they had eaten, they set out again. They climbed slowly down the southern side of the ridge, but the way was much easier than they had expected, for the slope was far less steep on this side, and before long Frodo was able to ride again. Bill Ferny's poor old pony was developing an unexpected talent for picking out a path, and for sparing its rider as many jolts as possible. The spirits of the party rose again. Even Frodo felt better in the morning light, but every now and again a mist seemed to obscure his sight, and he passed his hands over his eyes. Pippin was a little ahead of the others. Suddenly he turned round and called to them. "There is a path here," he cried. When they came up with him, they saw that he had made no mistake. They were clearly the beginnings of a path that climbed with many winding out of the wood below and faded away on the hill top behind. In places it was now faint and overgrown, or choked with fallen stones and trees, but at one time it seemed to have been much used. It was a path made by strong arms and heavy feet. Here there are old trees that had been cut or broken down, and large rocks cloven or heaved aside to make a way. They followed the track for some while, for it offered much the easiest way down. But they went cautiously, and their anxiety increased as they came into the dark woods, and their path grew plainer and broader. Suddenly coming out of a belt of fir trees, it ran steeply down a slope, then turned sharply to the left round the corner of a rocky shoulder of the hill. When they came to the corner, they looked round and saw that the path ran on over a level strip under the face of a low cliff overhung with trees. In the stony wall there was a door hanging crookedly ajar upon one great hinge. Outside the door they all halted. There was a cave or rock chamber behind, but in the gloom inside nothing could be seen. Strider, Sam, and Merry, pushing with all their strength, managed to open the door a little wider. Then Strider and Merry went in. They did not go far, for on the floor lay many old bones, and nothing else was to be seen near the entrance except some great empty jars and broken pots. "Surely this is a troll hole if there ever was one," said Pippin. "Come out, you two, and let us get away. Now we know who made the path, and we had better get off it quick." So to pause here, if you remember from The Hobbit, you can probably guess where exactly they are and what exactly they've just discovered. This was the troll hole where Bilbo and Gandalf and Thorin and all the others found a lot of treasure, some food that they took with them, and of course the magnificent swords from Gondolin, Glamdring and Orcrist, and the little dagger that Bilbo would later name Sting. "Hey there, Zelda-man. A wizard is never late, nor is he early. He arrives precisely when he means to." We can't talk about that troll hole. Nice. It's a little bit of a John Romero reference there, right? Okay, so like I said, if you're hearkening back to the Hobbit, you could tell exactly where they are, and that means you know how close they are to Rivendell. "There is no need, I think," said Strider, coming out. "It is certainly a troll hole, but it seems to have been long forsaken. I don't think we need be afraid. But let us go on down warily, and we shall see." The path went on again from the door, and turning to the right again across the level space, plunged down into a thick wooded slope. Pippin, not liking to show Strider that he was still afraid, went on ahead with Merry. Sam and Strider came behind, one on each side of Frodo's pony, for the path was now broad enough for 4 or 5 hobbits to walk abreast. But they had not gone very far before Pippin came running back, followed by Merry. They both looked terrified. "There are trolls," Pippin panted. "Down in a clearing in the woods not far below. We got a sight of them through the tree trunks. They are very large." "We will come and look at them," said Strider, picking up a stick. Frodo said nothing, but Sam looked scared. The sun was now high, and it shone down through the half-stripped branches of the trees and lit the clearing with bright patches of light. They halted suddenly on the edge and peered through the tree trunks, holding their breath. There stood the trolls, 3 large trolls. One was stooping, and the other 2 were staring at him. Strider walked forward unconcernedly. "Get up, old stone," he said, and broke his stick upon the stooping troll. Nothing happened. There was a gasp of astonishment from the hobbits, and then even Frodo laughed. "Well," he said, "we are forgetting our family history. These must be the very 3 that were caught by Gandalf quarreling over the right way to cook 13 dwarves and 1 hobbit." "I had no idea we were anywhere near the place," said Pippin. He knew the story well. Bilbo and Frodo had told it often, but as a matter of fact, he had never more than half believed it. Even now he looked at the stone trolls with suspicion, wondering if some magic might not suddenly bring them to life again. Yeah, troll, lo, 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 lo. So it's interesting here, our little note about Pippin, how he only ever really half believed the story. And this really goes to say that, like, it kind of goes back to the chapter A Shadow of the Past, where we learn a lot of Gollum's backstory. And Frodo learns about Gollum, and we get this impression that, even though he didn't have any cause to disbelieve any of the things that Bilbo had told him about his adventures, to him, Gollum was a character in a book that his cousin wrote. That, of course, he said was based on his own exploits. And we know that not everything that Bilbo wrote was true. There were a lot of things he wrote that were close to true, or they were slightly embellished, or even things that were downplayed. But, of course, the thing with the trolls, that really happened. One of the things that Tolkien had in his mind when he had the thought, after publishing The Lord of the Rings, to rewrite The Hobbit in the style of The Lord of the Rings, and sort of presented it as this is the way it really happened, whereas the previous version, that was the way that Bilbo told it, and he was convinced not to do this, to let The Hobbit stand on its own as its own unique style of storytelling. But what is really interesting is that in this proposed rewrite, you do get some details that answered some questions that people had, such as, how come Gandalf couldn't read the runes on the swords? They took the swords, Glamdring and Orcrist, to Rivendell, and Elrond was able to read them. And you would think, well, why would Gandalf not be able to read them? And there are a lot of reasons that we could say, such as Gandalf not being specifically familiar with the language used in Gondolin. But Tolkien's idea was that the reason that he couldn't read the runes on the swords were that they were actually encrusted with old blood, and that they needed to be cleaned, and that when they brought them to Rivendell, that Elrond had these swords cleaned and revealed the runes that were there. Tomatoes and some nice crispy bacon. Now, what's interesting about that is that a lot of people pointed out that there shouldn't have been tomatoes, but of course Tolkien did mention tomatoes in a few early revisions and such, so I don't get too concerned with things like that, about food. People say, well, tomatoes are from South America, how does that happen? Well, maybe the tomatoes came from Numenor, maybe they came from the Undying Lands and somebody grew them, There's a lot of different explanations that could be made. But anyway, yeah, there we have the trolls. Let's see. They all laughed. Oh, I skipped a part here. You are forgetting not only your family history, but all you ever knew about trolls, said Strider. It is broad daylight with a bright sun, and yet you come back trying to scare me with a tale of live trolls waiting for us in this glade. In any case, you might have noticed that one of them has an old bird's nest behind his ear. That would be a most unusual ornament for a live troll. I hate to pause again so suddenly, but I do have to go into this. So there are actually trolls that can move around in the daylight and not be killed. They're called Ulughai. They don't really exist in this part of Middle-earth, though, so Aragorn is right to assume that there aren't really trolls walking around or living in the daylight. The Ulughai were actually created by Sauron, and it was sort of hinted in the lore that they only existed as a manifestation of Sauron's will, and so when his power broke, they probably all just died or stopped existing at that point. And Ologhai, by the way, translates to trollmen. They all laughed. Frodo felt his spirits reviving. The reminder of Bilbo's first successful adventure was heartening. The sun, too, was warm and comforting, and the mist before his eyes seemed to be lifting a little. They rested for some time in the glade and took their midday meal right under the shadow of the troll's large legs. "Won't somebody give us a bit of song while the sun is high?" said Merry when they had finished. "We haven't had a song or a tale for days." "Not since Weathertop," said Frodo. The others looked at him. "Don't worry about me," he said. "I feel much better. But I don't think I could sing. Perhaps Sam could dig something out of his memory." "Come on, Sam," said Merry. "There's more stored in your head than you let on about." I'm not sure what you're asking, Zelda man. "I don't know about that," said Sam. "But how would this suit? It ain't what I call proper poetry, if you understand me, just a bit of nonsense, but these old images here brought it to my mind." Standing up with his hands behind his back, as if he were at school, he began to sing to an old tune. "Troll sat alone on a seat of stone, and munched and mumbled a bare old bone. For many a year he gnawed it near, for meat was hard to come by, done by, gum by. In a cave in the hills he dwelt alone, and meat was hard to come by. Up came Tom with his big boots on. Said he to the troll, 'Pray, what is you? For it looks like the shin of my Uncle Tim, as should be lying in graveyard, caveyard, paveyard. This many a year has Tim gone by, and I thought he were lying in a graveyard.' 'My lad,' said the troll, 'this bone I stole, but what be bones that lie in a hole? Thine uncle was dead as a lump of lead afore I found his shin bone. Tin bone, thin bone. He can spare a share for a poor old troll, for he don't need his shin bone.' Said Tom, 'I don't see why the likes of thee, without axe and leave, should go making free without the shank or the shin of my father's kin, so hand the old bone over, rover, trover. Though dead he be, it belongs to he, so hand the old bone over.' 'For a couple of pins,' says Troll and grins, 'I'll eat thee too and gnaw thy shins. A bit of fresh meat will go down sweet, I'll try my teeth on thee now. He now, see now. I'm tired of gnawing old bones and shins, I've a mind to dine on thee now.' But just as he thought his dinner was caught, he found his hands had hold of naught. Before he could mind, Tom slipped behind and gave him the boot to learn him, warn him, darn him. A lump on the boot of the seat, Tom thought, would be the way to larn him. But harder than stone is the flesh and bone of a troll that sits in these hills alone. As well set your boot to the mountain's root, for the seed of a troll don't feel it, peel it, heal it. The old troll laughed when he heard Tom groan, and he knew his toes could feel it. Tom's leg is game since home he came, and his bootless foot is lasting lame. But Troll don't care, and he's still there, with his bone he boned from its owner. Donor, boner. Troll's old seat is still the same, and the bone he boned from its owner." Oh, no, I don't. I doubt that somehow. Zelda man. "Well, that's a warning to us all," laughed Merry. "It is well you used a stick and not your hand, Strider." "Where did you come by that, Sam?" asked Pippin. "I've never heard those words before." Sam muttered something inaudible. "It's out of his own head, of course," said Frodo. "I am learning a lot about Sam Gamgee on this journey. First, he was a conspirator, now he's a jester. He'll end up becoming a wizard or a warrior." "I hope not," said Sam. "I don't want to be neither." In the afternoon they went on down the woods. They were probably following the very track that Gandalf, Bilbo, and the dwarves had used many years before. After a few miles, they came out on the top of a high bank above the road. At this point, the road had left the Horwell far behind in its narrow valley, and now clung close to the feet of the hills, rolling and winding eastward among woods and heather-covered slopes towards the fort and the mountains. Not far down the bank, Strider pointed out a stone in the grass. On it, roughly cut and now much weathered, could be seen dwarf runes and secret marks. "There," said Merry. "That must be the stone that marked the place where the troll's gold was hidden. How much is left of Bilbo's share, I wonder, Frodo?" Frodo looked at the stone and wished that Bilbo had brought home no treasure, more perilous, nor less easy to part with. "None at all," he said. "Bilbo gave it all away. He told me he did not feel it was really his, as it came from robbers." "Oh, EB, thank you for the sub. Oh my God. And it was so loud in my head. Thank you for subbing for 63 months. If we could get a bit of a celebration in the chat there with some emotes, demotes, remotes, and he became and subbed him. That kind of goes well with the troll poem that we just read there. How is Frodo feeling since Weathertop? Well, to answer that question, you notice that at nighttime, you made quite the impact there. At nighttime, he feels worse. He feels worse when it's wet and cold. In the sunshine, it's cheerful. I mentioned this a little bit before you came into the stream, but it's not like the movie where he gets stabbed and then he's just deathly ill and completely incapacitated. And hey, Ortree, how's it going? And then has to be basically carried to Rivendell. This has been 2 weeks now since he was stabbed, and the wound is closed, as Sam pointed out. He's just got a little bit of a scar there, but he's laughing and enjoying himself in the sunshine. It's when it gets wet and cold and dark that it starts to really bother him. And of course, he's getting worse, but it's happening rather gradually. The road lay quiet under the long shadows of early evening. There was no sign of any other travelers to be seen. As there was now no other possible course for them to take, they climbed down the bank and, turning left, went off as fast as they could. Soon a shoulder of the hills cut off the light of the fast westering sun. A cold wind flowed down to meet them from the mountains ahead. They were beginning to look out for a place off the road where they could camp for the night, where they heard a sound that brought sudden fear back into their hearts, the noise of hoofs behind them. They looked back, but they could not see far because of the many windings and rollings of the road. As quickly as they could, they scrambled off the beaten way and up into the deep heather and bilberry brushwood on the slopes above, until they came to a patch of thick growing hazel. As they peered out from among the bushes, they could see the road, faint and grey in the failing light, some 30 feet below them. The sound of hoofs grew nearer. They were going fast, with a light clippity-clippity-clip. Then faintly, as if blown away from them by a breeze, they seemed to catch a dim ringing, as of small bells tinkling. Din, din. Whenever I hear din, din, it reminds me of the way that June used to announce that she was going to dinner. She would just be like, din, 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 OMG, din, din, and then she'd be gone for like an hour. Yeah. That does not sound like a Black Rider's horse, said Frodo, listening intently. The other hobbits agreed hopefully that it did not, but they all remained full of suspicion. They had been in fear of pursuit for so long that any sound from behind them seemed ominous and unfriendly, but Strider was now leaning forward, stooped to the ground with a hand to his ear and a look of joy on his face. The light faded, and the leaves on the bushes rustled softly. Clearer and nearer now the bells jingled, and clippity-clip came the quick trotting feet. Suddenly into view, below, came a white horse, gleaming in the shadows, running swiftly. In the dusk its headstall flickered and flashed as if it was studded with gems like living stars. The rider's cloak streamed behind him, and his hood was thrown back. His golden hair flowed, shimmering in the wind of his speed. To Frodo it appeared that a white light was shining through the form and raiment of the rider, as if through a thin veil. I have to pause here. So we're getting our first glimpse at Glorfindel. And Frodo sees an inner light coming out of him. And this is not because of the ring, because he's not wearing the ring. This is because of the wound in his shoulder. He's starting to fade. He's becoming undead. And this is why the situation is so dire here. And as he fades into the Wraith world, much like putting on the ring, he is able to see spirits. And he is seeing Glorfindel's true glory. Now, not all elves will appear like that. Glorfindel is a unique case. I'm going to give you a little bit of his history. He was the head of an important house of elves in Gondolin. And when Gondolin fell, it was attacked by Morgoth. He sent his orcs and his trolls and his balrogs and his dragons, and they just tore the city to pieces. And a certain remnant was able to escape through a secret tunnel. And as these refugees were making their way to the west, they were trying to get to Lindon and to be with Gil-galad. And they were attacked by a Balrog. And Glorfindel came and he fought the Balrog and he wrestled with it. And he managed to get his dagger out and stab the thing in his stomach and killed it. But as it fell into a ravine, it grabbed Glorfindel by his hair and dragged him down, and Glorfindel died. And the Lord of the Eagles appeared, Thorondor, and he went down into the ravine, and he scooped up Glorfindel, and he brought him to a place where he could be buried properly. And his place became covered by these yellow flowers, and it was very beautiful, and it was unmarred and not touched by evil until, the entirety of that region sank into the sea later on. Of course, elves don't really die, they just go home. So Glorfindel wound up spending some time in Mandos. After his body fully withered, he got a new body. And sometime in the Second Age, he came to Middle-earth on a mission along with the two of the wizards, Marenitar and Ramastana, the blue wizards. But he was uniquely empowered by Manwe. He was given angelic power. He's not an angel like Gandalf is an angel, but he was given angelic power. And we're going to see the other side of that coin is the Witch King. The Witch King is given demonic power by Sauron. Glorfindel is given angelic power by Manwe. They are sort of like opposed. Glorfindel is the one that gave the prophecy in the Angmar War that said that no man will be the one that brings the Witch King to his doom. The exact words of the prophecy were, his doom lies far off and not by the hand of man. And this was Tolkien's sort of jabbing at Shakespeare a little bit, because there was a bit of a prophecy in Macbeth, no man born of woman. So Tolkien, when reading Macbeth as a young man, interpreted this as being a woman. Not a man, but a woman. And he was very disappointed that Shakespeare did not go that direction, but instead had a man who was born by cesarean section, so sort of skirting around the definition of no man born by woman. I would personally say that if you are delivered via a cesarean section, you are still born of woman. And Tolkien agreed with that sentiment, so he found that part of Macbeth to be disappointing. So this is where it comes into long off is his doom and not by the hand of man. It has multiple meanings. Man being the race of men, because Merry is involved, not just Eowyn. Man as in the singular, because it is two mortals that bring the Witch King to his doom, not one. And man as in the gender, as it is a woman who finishes off the Witch King with a killing blow. So I'm getting into a lot here, but the main thing is that Frodo seeing Glorfindel as glowing is actually a bad thing, because he's starting to fade away. He's starting to become like a wraith. And yes, that was the line in the film. She said, "I am no man," and then just stabbed him right in the head. It's a little different in the book when we get to not the Two Towers. When we get to the Return of the King, you'll see what I mean. Her line is a little different, but basically the same sort of sentiment, not the same words. Okay. Strider sprang from hiding and dashed down towards the road, leaping with a cry through the heather. But even before he had moved a coal, the rider had reined his horse and halted, looking up toward the thicket where they stood. When he saw Strider, he dismounted and ran to meet him, calling out, "Ein avedu Dunadan, my Govanan." His speech and clear ringing voice left no doubt in their hearts. The rider was of the elven folk. No others that dwelt in the wide world had heard voices so fair to hear. But there seemed to be a note of haste or fear in his call, and they saw now that he was speaking quickly and urgently to Strider. Soon Strider beckoned to him, and the hobbits left the bushes and hurried down to the road. "This is Glorfindel, who dwells in the house of Elrond," said Strider. "Hail and well met at last," said the elf lord to Frodo. "I was sent to Rivendell to look for you. We feared that you were in danger upon the road." "Then Gandalf has reached Rivendell," cried Frodo joyfully. "No, he had not when I departed, but that was 9 days ago," answered Glorfindel. "Elrond received news that troubled him. Some of my kindred, journeying to land beyond the Baranduin, learned that things were amiss and sent messages as swiftly as they could. They said that the Nine were abroad, and that you were astray, bearing a great burden without guidance, for Gandalf had not returned. There are few even in Rivendell that can ride openly against the Nine, but such as they were Elrond sent out north, west, and south. It was thought that you might turn far aside to avoid pursuit, and become lost in the wilderness. Now, there is a... No, this is not Legolas. Legolas, in the animated film, it was, but this is Glorfindel. In the animated, you got me all confused here. Sorry about that. There is a footnote here when he mentioned land beyond the Baranduin, and it notes that is the Brandywine River. He's just using the Elvish name. I also want to point out the Sindarin words he used here. Ainevedui is sort of like hello, greetings, and then he says Dunadan, which is man of the West. I used the word Dunedain earlier. Dunedain is just singular. Dunedain is plural, and then Mai Gavanan is sort of like well met. So it's just a greeting saying like, hail there, man of the West, well met. That's the basic translation of that. Okay, let's see, where was I? Oh, here we are. It was my lot to take the road, and I came to the bridge of Mithaliel, and left a token there nigh on 7 days ago. 3 of the servants of Sauron were upon the bridge, but they withdrew, and I pursued them westward. I came also upon 2 others, but they turned away southward. Since then I have searched for your trail. 2 days ago I found it, and followed it over the bridge, and today I marked where you descended from the hills again. But come, there is no time for further news. Since you are here, we must risk the peril of the road and go. There are 5 behind us, and when they find your trail upon the road, they will ride after us like the wind, and they are not all. Where the other 4 may be, I do not know. I fear that we may find the ford is already held against us. While Glorfindel was speaking, the shades of evening deepened. Frodo felt a great weariness come over him. Ever since the sun began to sink in the mist before his eyes had darkened, and he felt a shadow was coming between him and the faces of his friends. Now pain assailed him, and he felt cold. He swayed, clutching at Sam's arm. My master is sick and wounded, said Sam angrily. He can't go on riding after nightfall. He needs rest. Glorfindel caught Frodo as he sank to the ground, and taking him gently in his arms, he looked at his face with grave anxiety. Briefly Strider told of the attack on their camp under Weathertop, and of the deadly knife. He drew out the hilt, which he had kept, and handed it to the elf. Glorfindel shuddered as he took it, but he looked intently at it. There are evil things written on the hilt, he said. Though maybe your eyes cannot see them, keep it, Aragorn, until it reach the house of Elrond, but be wary and handle it as little as you may. Alas, the wounds of this weapon are beyond my skill to heal. I will do what I can, but all the more do I urge you now to get on without rest. He searched the wound on Frodo's shoulder with his finger, and his face grew graver, as if what he learned disquieted him. But Frodo felt the chill lessen in his side and arm. A little warmth crept down from his shoulder into his hand, and the pain grew easier. The dusk of evening seemed to grow lighter about him, as if a cloud had been withdrawn. He saw his friends' faces more clearly again, and a measure of new hope and strength returned. You shall ride my horse, said Glorfindel. I will shorten the stirrups up to the saddle-skirts, and you must sit as tight as you can. But you need not fear. My horse will not let any rider fall that I command him to bear. His pace is light and smooth, and if danger presses too near, he will bear you away with a speed that even the black steeds of the enemy cannot rival. No, he will not, said Frodo. I shall not ride him if I am to be carried off to Rivendell or anywhere else, leaving my friends behind in danger. Glorfindel smiled. I doubt very much, he said, if your friends would be in danger if you were not with them. The pursuit would follow you and leave us in peace, I think. It is you, Frodo, and that which you bear that brings us all in peril. To that Frodo had no answer, and he was persuaded to mount Glorfindel's white horse. The pony was laden instead with a great part of the other's burden, so that they now marched lighter, and for a time made good speed, but the hobbits began to find it hard to keep up with the swift, tireless feet of the elf. On he led them into the mouth of darkness, and still on under the deep clouded night. There was neither star nor moon. Not until the grey of dawn did he allow them to halt. Pippin, Merry, and Sam were by that time nearly asleep on their stumbling legs, and even Strider seemed, by the sag of his shoulders, to be weary. Frodo sat upon the horse in a dark dream. They cast themselves down in the heather a few yards from the roadside and fell deep asleep immediately. They seemed hardly to have closed their eyes when Glorfindel, who had set himself to watch while they slept, awoke them again. The sun had now climbed far into the morning, and the clouds and mists of the night were gone. "Drink this," said Glorfindel to them, pouring for each in turn a little liquor from his silver-studded flask of leather. It was clear as spring water and had no taste, but it did not feel either cold or warm in the mouth. But strength and vigor seemed to flow into all their limbs as they drank it. Eaten after they had dropped, the stale bread and dried fruit, which was now all they had left, seemed to satisfy their hunger better than many a good breakfast in the Shire had done. They had rested rather less than 5 hours when they took to the road again. Glorfindel still urged them on, and only allowed 2 brief halts during the day's march. In this way they covered almost 20 miles before nightfall, and came to a point where the road bent right, and ran down toward the bottom of the valley, now making straight for the Bruinen. So far there had been no sign or sound of pursuit that the hobbits could see or hear, but often Glorfindel would halt and listen for a moment, if they lagged behind, and a look of anxiety clouded his face. Once or twice he spoke to Strider in the elf tongue. But however anxious their guides may be, it was plain that the hobbits could go no further that night. They were stumbling along, dizzy with weariness, and unable to think of anything but their feet and legs. Frodo's pain had redoubled, and during the day things about him faded to shadows of ghostly grey. He almost welcomed the coming of night, for then the world seemed less pale and empty. The hobbits were still weary when they set out again early next morning. There were many miles yet to go between them and the ford, and they hobbled forward at the best pace they could manage. "Our peril will be greatest just ere we reach the river," said Glorfindel, "for my heart warns me that the pursuit is now swift behind us, and other danger may be waiting by the ford." The road was still running steadily downhill, and there was now in places much grass at either side, in which the hobbits walked when they could, to ease their tired feet. In the late afternoon they came to a place where the road went suddenly under the dark shadow of tall pine trees, then plunged into a deep cutting with steep, moist, wet walls of red stone. Echoes ran along as they hurried forward, and there seemed to be a sound of many footfalls following their own. All at once, as if through a gate of light, the road ran out again from the end of the tunnel into the open. There, at the bottom of a sharp incline, they saw before them a long, flat mile, and beyond that, the ford of Rivendell. On the further side was a steep brown bank, threaded by a winding path, and behind that the tall mountains climbed, shoulder above shoulder and peak beyond peak into the fading sky. There was still an echo, as of following feet in the cutting behind them, a rushing noise, as if a wind were rising and pouring through the branches of the pines. One moment Glorfindel turned and listened, then he sprang forward with a loud cry. "Fly!" he called. "Fly! The enemy is upon us!" The white horse leaped forward. The hobbits ran down the slope. Glorfindel and Strider followed as rear guard. They were only halfway across the flat when suddenly there was a noise of horses galloping. Out of the gate in the trees they had just left there rode a black rider. He reined his horse in and halted, swaying in his saddle. Another followed him, and then another, then again 2 more. "Ride forward, ride!" cried Glorfindel to Frodo. He did not obey at once, for a strange reluctance seized him. Checking the horse to a walk, he turned and looked back. The riders seemed to sit upon their great steeds like threatening statues upon a hill, dark and solid, while all the woods and land about them receded as if into a mist. Suddenly he knew in his heart that they were silently commanding him to wait. Then at once fear and hatred awoke in him. His hand left the bridle and gripped the hilt of the sword, and with a red flash he drew it. Ride on! Cried Glorfindel. And then loud and clear he called to the horse in the elf tongue, Norulim, Norulim Asphaloth. At once the white horse sprang away and sped like the wind along the last lap of the road. At the same moment the black horses leaped down the hill in pursuit, and from the riders came a terrible cry such as Frodo had heard, filling the woods with horror in the east farthing far away. It was answered, and to the dismay of Frodo and his friends, out from the trees and rocks away on the left, 4 other riders came flying. 2 rode toward Frodo, 2 galloped madly towards the ford to cut off his escape. They seemed to him to run like the wind and to grow swiftly larger and darker as their courses converged with him. Frodo looked back for a moment over his shoulder. He could no longer see his friends. The riders were falling back. Even their great steeds were no match in speed for the white elf horse of Glorfindel. He looked forward again and hope faded. There seemed no chance of reaching the ford before he was cut off by the others that had lain in ambush. He could see them clearly now. They appeared to have cast aside their hoods and black cloaks, and they were robed in white and grey. Swords were naked in their pale hands. Helms were on their heads. Their cold eyes glittered, and they called to him with fell voices. Fear now filled all of Frodo's mind. He thought no longer of his sword. No cry came from him. He shut his eyes and clung to the horse's mane. The wind whistled in his ears, and the bells upon the harnesses rang wild and shrill. A breath of deadly cold pierced him like a spear. As if with a last spurt, like a flash of white fire, the elf horse, speeding on as if on wings, passed right before the face of the foremost rider. Frodo heard the splash of water. It foamed about his feet. He felt the quick heave and surge as the horse left the river and struggled up the stony path. He was climbing the steep bank. He was across the ford. But the pursuers were close behind. At the top of the bank, the horse halted and turned about, neighing fiercely. There were 9 riders at the water's edge below, and Frodo's spirit quailed before the threat of their uplifted faces. He knew of nothing that would prevent them from crossing as easily as he had done, and he felt that it was useless to try to escape over the long, uncertain path from the ford to the edge of Rivendell, if once the riders crossed. In any case, he felt that he was commanded urgently to halt. Hatred again stirred in him, but he had no longer the strength to refuse. Suddenly, the foremost rider spurred his horse forward. It checked at the water and reared up. With a great effort, Frodo sat upright and brandished his sword. "Go back," he cried. "Go back to the land of Mordor, and follow me no more." His voice sounded thin and shrill in his own ears. The riders halted, but Frodo had not the power of Bombadil. His enemies laughed at him with a harsh and chilling laughter. "Come back! Come back!" they called. "To Mordor we will take you." "Go back," he whispered. "The ring! The ring!" they cried with deadly voices. And immediately their leader urged his horse forward into the water, followed closely by 2 others. "By Elbereth and Luthien the Fair," said Frodo, with a last effort, lifting up his sword, "you shall have neither ring nor me." Then the leader, who was now half across the ford, stood up menacing in his stirrups and raised up his hand. Frodo was stricken dumb. He felt his tongue cleave to his mouth, and his heart laboring. His sword broke and fell out of his shaking hand. The elf horse reared and snorted. The foremost of the black horses had almost set foot upon the shore. At that moment there came a roaring and a rushing, a noise of loud waters ruling many stones. Dimly, Frodo saw the river below him rise, and down along its course there came a plumed cavalry of waves. White flame seemed to Frodo to flicker on their crests, and he half fancied that he saw amid the water white riders upon white horses with frothing manes. The 3 riders that were still in the midst of the ford were overwhelmed. They disappeared, buried suddenly under the angry foam. Those that were behind drew back in dismay. With his last failing senses, Frodo heard cries, and it seemed to him that he saw, beyond the riders that hesitated on the shore, a shining figure of white light, and behind it ran small shadowy forms waving flames that flared red in the grey mist that was fouling the world. The black horses were filled with madness, and leaping forward in terror they bore their riders into the rushing flood. Their piercing cries were drowned in the roaring of the river as it carried them away. Then Frodo felt himself falling, and the roaring and confusion seemed to rise and engulf him together with his enemies. He heard and saw no more. So, that is the end of Chapter 12 and the end of Book 1. There's a lot to talk about, so we're going to pause here. I'm going to drink me some water, and then we'll talk about it. So, once again, comparisons to the film version. Let's start with that. Now, an interesting thing is, as we know, the character of Glorfindel was left out of both film versions. The animated film, they put Legolas there. In the live-action film, they used Arwen. The Arwen part is actually pretty close, except like she's taking on the traits of a lot of other characters. Glorfindel, Gandalf, Aragorn even, Frodo to a certain extent, Elrond. What's interesting is when he is told to ride forward, and Frodo is reluctant to do so, partly because he doesn't want to leave his friends behind, and partly because the Witch King is commanding him to halt, and he's finding it very difficult to resist these commands. I almost said Legolas there. Glorfindel calls not to Frodo, but to the horse. Where is that? if I could find that exact moment here. Norulim Asfalath. And that line is actually in the film. It's Arwen says it, but she's on the horse carrying Frodo. And a lot of people in the Tolkien community at the time made the joke that she stole Glorfindel's horse. She just grabbed his horse and ran out to meet them. So Asfaloth made it into the film, even though Glorfindel did not. We get a sense of the power of the Witch King here, and also the really dire danger that Frodo's in, not just from the Nazgul, but from the wound that is killing him. I mentioned that when Glorfindel first appeared, Frodo could see a faint glow coming out of him. And that is not a good thing, because the fact that he's able to see this angelic light bursting out of him, even faintly, is showing that Frodo is slipping into the Wraith world. And here we see that he sees the Nazgul as they are, robed in white with their helms and everything. They're no longer invisible beneath their cloaks. They can be seen by him. And then when he sees Glorfindel next, he is a brilliant bright white light, while his friends are shadowy figures waving fire. And of course, the flood comes. Now, they did a great job in the film showing the flood as looking like horses, although there were no riders on the horses in the film, but that's okay. And of course, it made it seem like this was something that Arwen was doing. It's not something that Arwen was doing. It's actually Elrond that's doing this, with a little bit of help from Gandalf, as we'll learn in Book 2. But it's mostly Elrond doing it with his Ring of Power, actually. He has one of the 3 elven rings of power, the one that's called Vilya, or the Ring of Air, and he's using that to create the flood. Gandalf's the one making it look like horses and riders and add some extra power to it. The film, like I said, made it seem like Arwen was doing this. But anyway, what's interesting is that we all sort of like have this memory of the flood coming and washing away all of the Nazgul, when actually it only washed away 3 of them, and it was Glorfindel and Aragorn and the hobbits, Sam and Merry and Pippin, with waving flaming sticks and such, who drove the other 6 into the flood. Now, Gandalf made a comment once that said that the Witch King and the Nazgul, they're so powerful that no one could really, stand against them, and people will wonder, well, how did this happen? Here's the thing, though. It wasn't that they drove the Nazgul into the flood. It was they drove the horses into the flood. These horses, they're not demons. They're not bred in Mordor. They're from Rohan. They're regular horses from Rohan. And we learn later that, in the Two Towers, actually, that Sauron actually came to Rohan. He didn't physically come to Rohan, but he sent an emissary to Rohan to try to buy horses from them. And can you imagine that? Can you imagine being Theoden and having somebody come from Mordor or send a message from Mordor asking, hey, could we buy some of your horses? And of course they said no. So they did what Mordor does. They just took the horses anyway. They stole them. And Éomer makes a comment that they only stole the black horses. And you wonder, okay, so matching black cloaks for all of the Nazgul, we can understand that, but all black horses. Sauron's being a little extra here, a little bit of theater put into it, trying to play up the intimidation factor, and just to make them look cool and intimidating, really. Any horse bred in Rohan is going to be, fantastic. And of course, these horses are brought to Mordor, and they're trained to be able to ride, to allow the Nazgul to ride them, because normally their fear aura would affect the horses. I don't imagine what these animals have been through. Now, a lot of people wonder, well, what happens to the Nazgul after this? Obviously, they pop up back again later, but what becomes of them after this scene? And what happens is basically they're not quite dead. They're not quite alive. They're in this weird undead state, so they can't be killed quite so easily. The horses, though, almost all of them are dead. There's one horse that survives the flood. The Witch King finds the horse. He rides it down to Mordor, and he basically gets powered up by Sauron. I mentioned how Glorfindel, the elf, was powered up by Manwë with angelic power. the Witch King gets powered up by Sauron with what Tolkien refers to as demonic force. And then he comes back, and he's able to gather the other 8 who are sort of lost and wandering. And they brings them all to Mordor, and they're given new steeds, and that's when they get their flying steeds. And Frodo already had a prophetic dream about the Nazgul flying. But this is why we don't see them for quite some time, because now the Witch King has to find the horse. He has to ride all the way to Mordor, get himself powered up, ride all the way back, and then bring them all the way down to Mordor. These horses are fast and everything, but it's a lot of travel involved. And this is why Frodo is able to stay in Rivendell for a really long time. And I think they're there for like 6 weeks before they leave. The Fellowship is formed, and they leave, believe it or not, on Christmas Day, which by the way makes the Fellowship of the Ring a Christmas movie. And of course they don't have Christmas, because Christmas is like a Jesus thing, and this is like well before that. They have Yule, but it's interesting that they actually depart on their journey on December 25th. Christmas, the day that Rocky fought Ivan Drago, very important day. Anyway, that's book 1. We're going to get into book 2. Was there anything else I wanted to mention here? Okay, interesting. When Glorfindel calls to them and he tells them, he says, "Fly, fly, the enemy is upon you." And Tolkien uses the word fly a lot to mean flee, basically, to escape with great haste. And we know the famous scene where Gandalf falls in Moria, and he says, "Fly, you fools." And some people, especially people who are coming off of the film versions, have this sort of alternate interpretation. They say, well, what if he was telling them that they should have flown on eagles? And of course, I don't even get into the eagle thing. The eagle thing is so tired. It's not intelligent. It's not interesting. It's not worth discussing any more than I already have many, many times over of why the eagle thing doesn't work. But what's interesting is, we're seeing it here, is Glorfindel literally telling Frodo and Aragorn and Merry and Pippin and Sam to take flight somehow, to go and soar through the air? Of course not. Tolkien doesn't use that word that way unless he's specifically saying fly through the air. There's a discussion that comes up about whether Balrogs have wings. This discussion is nearly as tired and unintelligent as the eagle thing. Not quite as much, but nearly so. Nearly as bad. And Balrogs do not have wings, but some people will say that in the Silmarillion it says that they had wings, and then some other people will say, well, no, it doesn't say that. What it says is that they ran with winged speed. And then I will say, it doesn't even say that. This gets quoted so often. It's one of those things that's a quote that somebody made up. Okay? Somebody made up the quote that said that the Balrogs moved with wing speed. And that it doesn't mean that they flew, but that they were just very fast, as fast as a bird might fly. But that's not even what it says. What it says is that they rose up out of the depths of Angband and that they passed over Hithlum. That doesn't say anything about wing speed. I don't think the phrase wing speed even appears in the Silmarillion. And you know what? I could tell, double, triple, quadruple check for you right now, actually, if I bring up my digital copy here. I mean, I have the actual Silmarillion sitting right here. It's never far away, but I can't very well flip through every page and scan it with my eyes to see if the phrase wing speed appears. If it does appear, certainly not referring to the Balrogs. But let me, real quick. Winged? Okay. So the word winged appears in the Silmarillion, according to my search here, a grand total of 1 time. Oh, it hadn't loaded fully. Okay, 2 times. 3 times. Okay, it's slowly loading. But I'm going to tell you all the instances of wings here. Okay, now it's up to 4. But let's, for some reason the PDF didn't load all at once. That's why it was only giving me 1. But here, winged. The first instance of winged in the Silmarillion Therefore Ulmo, submitting to the will of the Valar, led them to Osse, their friend. And he, though grieving, taught them the craft of shipbuilding, and when their ships were built, he brought them as his parting gift many strong winged swans, referring to the wings of swans, nothing to do with Balrog, the second instance of winged. Then Beren perceived that Luthien could not be divided from that doom that lay upon them both, and he sought no longer to dissuade her. By the counsel of Huan and the arts of Luthien, he was arrayed now in the hame of Dragluin, and she in the winged fell of Thringwithil. So referring to Thringwithil, which is a vampire, and saying that she had wings, not a Balrog, a vampire. The third instance, Luthien catching up her winged robe sprang into the air. Luthien is flying because she has a robe that allows her to fly. Still not referring to Balrogs. Here's the next one. But he loosed upon his foes the last desperate assault that he had prepared, and out of the pits of Angband there issued the winged dragons. Not referring to Balrogs. The fifth one, and the winged crown of the kings of men were held in awe by people of many lands, a crown with wings on it, like Aragorn's crown, right? As a matter of fact, that actually is referring to Aragorn's crown, because that's at the end of the book. And then the sixth one is in the index, just referring to Ancalagon, greatest of the winged dragons of Morgoth. So, wing speed, a phrase that people say was in the Silmarillion, is not in the Silmarillion. It says passed over Hithlum, is what it says. And people will say, wait, that's not what wing speed means. It doesn't mean that they had wings. It just means that they were fast. And I will counter even that and say it doesn't even say that, though. It's sort of like, I wonder if it's sort of like the Mandela effect, you know? The Mandela effect is a false memory of sorts, usually very detailed, referring to Nelson Mandela, because people would say, I have this very clear memory of him dying in either the 80s or the 90s and seeing the funeral on TV, and it was a big deal, and I remember this very clearly, and of course that didn't happen. So when you remember very clearly something that didn't happen, it's the Mandela effect, you know? And we get these sort of discussions about, you know, whether the Fruit of the Loom logo has a horn of plenty in it or not, or whether the Monopoly man has a monocle or not, or those sort of things, you know? Does Kit Kat have a dash between the kit and the cat? The Flintstones, is it F-L-I-N or F-L-I-N-T? You know, Berenstein Bears, Berenstain Bears, that sort of thing. The Mandela effect. I have my own Mandela effect. It has to do with the show Better Call Saul. I'm not going to get into that right now because it's a whole story. But anyway, that's book 1. We're going to move on to book 2. Chapter 1, Many Meetings. Frodo woke and found himself lying in bed. At first he thought that he had slept late after a long, unpleasant dream that still hovered on the edge of memory. Or perhaps he had been ill, but the ceiling looked strange. It was flat, and it had dark beams richly carved. He lay a little while longer, looking at patches of sunlight on the wall and listening to the sound of a waterfall. "Where am I, and what is the time?" he said aloud to the ceiling. "In the house of Elrond, and it is 10 o'clock in the morning," said a voice. "It is the morning of October the 24th, if you want to know." "Gandalf!" cried Frodo, sitting up. There was the old wizard, sitting in a chair by the open window. "Yes," he said, "I am here. And you're lucky to be here, too, after all the absurd things you have done since you left home." Frodo lay down again. He felt too comfortable and peaceful to argue, and in any case he did not think that he would get the better of this argument. He was fully awake now, and the memory of his journey was returning. The disastrous shortcut through the old forest, the accident of the prancing pony, and his madness in putting on the ring in the dell under Weathertop. While he was thinking of all these things and trying in vain to bring his memory down to arriving in Rivendell, there was a long silence, broken only by the soft pulls of Gandalf's pipe as he blew white smoke rings out of the window. "Where's Sam?" Frodo asked at length. "And are the others all right?" "Yes, they are all safe and sound," answered Gandalf. "Sam was here until I sent him off to get some rest about half an hour ago." "What happened at the ford?" said Frodo. "It all seems so dim somehow. And it still does." "Yes, it would." "You were beginning to fade," answered Gandalf. "The wound was overcoming you at last. A few more hours and you would have been beyond our aid. But you have some strength in you, my dear hobbit. As you showed in the barrow, that was touch and go, perhaps the most dangerous moment of all. I wish you could have held out at Weathertop." You seem to know a great deal already, said Frodo. I have not spoken to the others about the barrow. At first it was too horrible, and afterwards there were other things to think about. How do you know about it? You have talked long in your sleep, Frodo, said Gandalf gently. And it has not been hard for me to read your mind and memory. Do not worry. Though I said absurd just now, I did not mean it. I think well of you and of the others. It is no small feat to have come so far, and through such danger still bearing the ring. We should never have done it without Strider, said Frodo. But we needed you. I did not know what to do without you. I was delayed, said Gandalf, and that nearly proved our ruin. And yet I am not sure. It may have been better so. I wish you would tell me what happened, all in good time. You're not supposed to talk or worry about anything today by Elrond's orders. But talking would stop me thinking and wondering, which are quite as tiring, said Frodo. I am wide awake now, and I remember so many things that want explaining. Why were you delayed? You ought to tell me that, at least. You will soon hear all you wish to know, said Gandalf. We shall have a council as soon as you are well enough. At the moment, I will only say that I was held captive. You, cried Frodo. Yes, I, Gandalf the Grey, said the Wisdom solemnly. There are many powers in this world, for good or for evil. Some are greater than I. Against some I have not yet been measured. But my time is coming. The Morgul Lord and his black riders have come forth. War is preparing. Then you knew of the riders already, before I met them? Yes, I knew of them. Indeed, I spoke once of them to you. For the black riders are the ring wraiths, the 9 servants of the Lord of the Rings. But I did not know that they had arisen again, or I should have fled with you at once. I heard news of them only after I left you in June. But that story must wait. For the moment we have been saved from disaster by Aragorn. Yes, said Frodo, it was Strider that saved us, yet I was afraid of him at first. Sam never quite trusted him, I think. Not at any rate until we met Glorfindel. Gandalf smiled. I have heard all about Sam, he said. He has no more doubts now. I am glad, said Frodo, for I have become very fond of Strider. Well, fond is not the right word. I mean, he is dear to me, though he is strange and grim at times. In fact, he reminds me often of you. I didn't know that any of the big people were like that. I thought, well, they were just big and rather stupid. Kind and stupid, like Butterbur, or stupid and wicked, like Bill Ferny. But then we don't know much about men in the Shire, except perhaps the Brelanders. You don't know much even about them if you think old Barlaam is stupid, said Gandalf. He is wise enough on his own ground. He thinks less than he talks, and slower. Yet he can see through a brick wall in time, as they say in Bree. But there are few left in Middle-earth like Aragorn, the son of Arathorn. The race of the kings from over the sea is nearly at an end. It may be that this War of the Ring will be their last adventure. Do you really mean that Strider is one of the people of the old king? Said Frodo in wonder. I thought they had all vanished long ago. I thought he was only a ranger. Only a ranger, cried Gandalf. My dear Frodo, that is just what the rangers are. The last remnant in the north of the great people, the men of the west. They have helped me before, and I shall need their help in the days to come, for we have reached Rivendell, but the ring is not yet at rest. I suppose not, said Frodo. But so far my only thought has been to get here, and I hope I shan't have to go any further. It is very pleasant just to rest. I have had a month of exile and adventure, and I find that has been as much as I want. He fell silent and shut his eyes. After a while he spoke again. I have been reckoning, he said, and I can't bring the total up to October the 24th. It ought to be the 21st. We must have reached the ford by the 20th. You have talked and reckoned more than is good for you, said Gandalf. How do the side and shoulder feel now? I don't know, Frodo answered. They don't feel at all, which is an improvement, but he made an effort. I can move my arm again a little. Yes, it's coming back to life. It's not cold, he added, touching his left hand with his right. Good, said Gandalf. It is mending fast. You will soon be sound again. Elrond has cured you. He has tended you for days, ever since you were brought in. Days, said Frodo. Well, 4 nights and 3 days, to be exact. The elves brought you from the ford on the night of the 20th, and that is where you lost count. We have been terribly anxious, and Sam has hardly left your side, day or night, except to run messages. Elrond is a master of healing, but the weapons of our enemy are deadly. To tell you the truth, I had very little hope, for I suspected that there was some fragment of the blade still in the closed wound. But it could not be found until last night. Then Elrond removed a splinter. It was deeply buried, and it was working inwards. Frodo shuddered, remembering the cruel knife with notched blade that had vanished in Strider's hands. Don't be alarmed, said Gandalf. It is gone now. It has been melted. and it seems that hobbits fade very reluctantly. I have known strong warriors of the big people who would quickly have been overcome by that splinter, which you bore for 17 days. What would they have done to me? Asked Frodo. What were the riders trying to do? They tried to pierce your heart with a mortal knife, which remains in the wound. If they had succeeded, you would have become like they are, only weaker and under their command. You would have become a wraith under the dominion of the Dark Lord, and he would have tormented you for trying to keep his ring, if any greater torment were possible than being robbed of it and seeing it on his hand. Thank goodness I did not realize the horrible danger, said Frodo faintly. I was mortally afraid, of course, but if I had known more, I should not have dared even to move. It is a marvel that I escaped. Yes, fortune or fate had helped you, said Gandalf. Not to mention courage, for your heart was not touched, only your shoulder was pierced. And that was because you resisted to the last. But it was a terribly narrow shave, so to speak. You were in grave peril when you wore the ring, for then you were half in the wraith world yourself, and they might have seized you. You could see them, and they could see you. I know, said Frodo. They were terrible to behold. But why could we see all their horses? Because they are real horses, just as the black robes are real robes that they wear to give shape to their nothingness when they have dealings with the living. Then why do these black horses endure such riders? All the other animals are terrified when they draw near, even the elf horse of Glorfindel. The dogs howl, and the geese scream at them. Because these horses are born and bred to the service of the Dark Lord and Mordor. Not all his servants are chattels and wraiths. There are orcs and trolls, there are wargs and werewolves, and there have been and still are many men, warriors and kings, that walk alive under the sun, and and yet are under his sway, and their number is growing daily. So to pause here briefly. So notice that Gandalf is sort of saying the opposite of what I said earlier, and in this case Gandalf is just, I don't want to say ignorant, but misinformed. He believes that the horses come from Mordor, that they're born and bred there. It is not until subsequent books that we learn that they're not from Mordor, that they're from Rohan. They were just stolen away by Mordor, as I mentioned earlier. And I can't help but wonder if The Lord of the Rings wasn't rushed out in the way that Tolkien describes it as being rushed out. He felt that it was too short, it was not that satisfying, it needed more time in the oven, so to speak. But of course, if Tolkien had his way, he never would have published it. He would have just kept revising it over and over again until he died, and then it would have been published perhaps sometime in the 1970s instead of the 1950s. And perhaps there wouldn't have been as much interest, because then you're very far removed from The Hobbit. So, at that point, were people really still waiting for the sequel to The Hobbit? No, they were waiting for the Silmarillion at that point. So, it's a good thing that Tolkien was sort of badgered by his friends, mostly C.S. Lewis, who Tolkien would tell him all this lore and all this background and all this world building, and C.S. Lewis would sort of say, that's great, that's wonderful, now give us a story. Lewis once described Tolkien as being a perfectionist and a procrastinator. And that is absolutely true. So I wonder if he would have revised this section for Gandalf not to say that, because there's a few points in which, Gandalf's sort of incorrect, and I think Gandalf's allowed to be incorrect. He's not perfect. Nobody really is. He makes mistakes from time to time, and he's just wrong about the horses here, as we will learn later. Anything else to comment on? Actually, there's probably other things to comment on. I already talked about Frodo fading and the idea of the lesser wraiths and such, so I don't think I need to go into that. A lot of the other stuff is going to be explained very shortly, when we get to the Council of Elrond. So yeah, I don't really think I need to explain any of that, really. I think we can just move on here. What about Rivendell and the elves? Is Rivendell safe? Yes, at present, until all else is conquered. The elves may fear the Dark Lord, and they may fly before him, but never again will they listen to him or serve him. And here in Rivendell there live still some of his chief foes, the Elven-wise, lords of the Eldar from beyond the furthest seas. They do not fear the ring-wraiths, for those who have dwelt in the Blessed Realm live at once in both worlds, and against both the seen and unseen they have great power. I thought I saw a white figure that shone and did not grow dim like the others. Was that Glorfindel, then? Yes. You saw him for a moment as he is upon the other side, one of the mighty of the firstborn. He is an elf lord of a house of princes. Indeed, there is a power in Rivendell to withstand the might of Mordor for a while, and elsewhere other powers still dwell. There is power, too, of another kind in the Shire, but all such places will soon become islands under siege if things go on as they are going. The Dark Lord is putting forth all his strength. Still, he said, standing suddenly up and sticking out his chin while his beard went stiff and straight like bristling wire, we must keep up our courage. You will soon be well. If I do not talk you to death, you are in Rivendell, and you need not worry about anything for the present. I haven't any courage to keep up, said Frodo, but I am not worried at the moment. Just give me news of my friends and tell me the end of the affair at the ford, as I keep on asking, and shall be content for the present. After that, I shall have another sleep, I think, but I shan't be able to close my eyes until you've finished the story for me. Gandalf moved his chair to the bedside and took a good look at Frodo. The colour had come back to his face, and his eyes were clear and fully awake and aware. He was smiling, and there seemed to be little wrong with him, but to the wizard's eye there was a faint change, just a hint, as it were, of transparency about him, and especially about the left hand that lay outside upon the coverlet. Still, that must be expected, said Gandalf to himself. He is not half through yet. And to what he will come in the end, not even Elrond can foretell. Not to evil, I think. He may become like a glass filled with a clear light for eyes to see that can. You look splendid, he said out loud. I will risk a brief tale without consulting Elrond, but quite brief, mind you, and then you must sleep again. This is what happened, as far as I can gather. The riders made straight for you as soon as you fled. They did not need the guidance of their horses any longer. You had become visible to them, having already on the threshold of their world. And also the ring drew them. Your friends sprang aside off the road, or they would have been ridden down. They knew that nothing could save you if the white horse could not. The riders were too swift to overtake, and too many to oppose. On foot, even Glorfindel and Aragorn together could not withstand the 9 all at once. When the ring-wraiths swept by, your friends ran up behind. Close to the ford there was a small hollow beside the road, masked by a few stunted trees. There they hastily kindled fire, for Glorfindel knew that a flood would come down if the riders tried to cross, and then he would have to deal with any that were left on his side of the river. The moment the flood appeared, he rushed out, followed by Aragorn and the others with flaming brands. Caught between fire and water, and seeing an elf lord revealed in his wrath, they were dismayed, and their horses were stricken with madness. 3 were carried away by the first assault of the flood, and the others were now hurled into the water by the horses and overwhelmed. And is that the end of the Black Riders? Asked Frodo. No, said Gandalf. Their horses must have perished, and without them they are crippled. But the ring-wraiths themselves cannot be so easily destroyed. However, there is nothing more to fear for them at present. Your friends crossed the flood, had been passed, and they found you lying on your face at the top of the bank, with a broken sword under you. The horse was standing guard beside you. You were pale and cold, and they feared that you were dead, or worse. Elrond's folk met them, carrying you slowly towards Rivendell. Who made the flood? Asked Frodo. Elrond commanded it, answered Gandalf. The river of this great valley is under his power, and it will rise in anger when he has great need to bar the ford. As soon as the captain of the ring-wraiths rode into the water, the flood was released. If I may say so, I added a few touches of my own, you may have noticed. But some of the waves took the form of great white horses with shining white riders, and there were many rolling and grinding boulders. For a moment I was afraid that we had let loose too fierce a wrath, and the flood would get out of hand and wash you all away. There is great vigor in the waters that come down from the snows of the misty mountains. Yes, it all comes back to me now, said Frodo. The tremendous roaring. I thought I was drowning, with my friends and enemies and all. But now we are safe. Gandalf looked quickly at Frodo, but he had shut his eyes. Yes, we were all safe for the present. Soon there will be feasting and merrymaking to celebrate the victory at the Ford Bruinen, and you will all be there in places of honor. Splendid, said Frodo. It is wonderful that Elrond and Glorfindel and such great lords, not to mention Strider, should take so much trouble to show me so much kindness. Well, there are many reasons why they should, said Gandalf, smiling. I am one good reason. The ring is another. You are the ring-bearer, and you are the heir of Bilbo the Ring-Finder. Dear Bilbo, said Frodo sleepily. I wonder where he is. I wish he was here and could hear all about it. It would have made him laugh. The cow jumped over the moon, and the poor old troll. With that, he fell fast asleep. I remembered what I was going to say earlier. There was something. Elrond. So Elrond heals Frodo, which, that's interesting to note. Now, just to get into the healing power of Elrond and how good of a healer he is, we've seen, of course, Aragorn is an excellent healer. And there is actually a prophecy in place that the hands of the king are healing hands, and him being a healer is part of the reason why he becomes the king in Gondor, because that's where that prophecy comes from. But of course, he looks at the wound and he says, "This is beyond me." And then Glorfindel, from the Undying Lands, who killed a Balrog. He was there for the fall of Gondolin. He has angelic power from Manwë. Came over the sea with 2 of the wizards. And even he says, "I can't heal this. This is beyond me." That's how good of a healer Elrond is. He's just that good. Okay. Frodo was now safe in the last homely house east of the sea. That house was, as Bilbo had long ago reported, a perfect house, whether you like food or sleep, or storytelling or singing, or just sitting and thinking best, or a pleasant mixture of them all. Merely to be there was a cure for weariness, fear, and sadness. As the evening drew on, Frodo woke up again, and he found that he no longer felt in need of rest or sleep, but had a mind for food and drink, and probably for singing and storytelling afterwards. He got out of bed and discovered that his arm was already nearly as useful again as it had ever been. He found laid ready clean garments of green cloth that fitted him excellently. Looking in a mirror, he was startled to see a much thinner reflection of himself than he remembered. It looked remarkably like the young nephew of Bilbo, who used to go tramping with his uncle in the Shire, but the eyes looked out at him thoughtfully. "Yes, you have seen a thing or two since you last peeped out of a looking-glass," he said to his reflection. "But now for a merry meeting." He stretched out his arms and whistled a tune. At that moment there was a knock on the door, and Sam came in. He ran to Frodo and took his left hand, awkwardly and shyly. He stroked it gently, and then he blushed and turned hastily away. "Hullo, Sam," said Frodo. "It's warm," said Sam. "Meaning your hand, Mr. Frodo. It has felt so cold through these long nights. But glory and trumpets," he cried, turning round again with shining eyes and dancing on the floor. "It's fine to see you up and yourself again, sir. Gandalf asked me to come and see if you were ready to come down, and I thought he was joking." "I am ready," said Frodo. "Let's go and look for the rest of the party." Sam sus? No, Sam is the least sus guy in the world. He is the most loyal and kind dude you could ever meet. Everybody deserves to have a friend like Sam. You love Sam so much. Hello there, Jemima. Yeah, Sam is... Oh, God. It's tough. Like, my favorite character is sort of really Gandalf, but Sam is up there, man. Sam is the greatest. Everybody, like I said, everybody deserves to have a friend like Sam. If everybody had a Sam, the world would be a better place, He's just the best guy, and then he can be fierce, He could be wise. He could be a lot of things. We saw with the poem that he had read out, the troll poem, and then they said, "Well, where did you hear that?" And he got all bashful, and was like, and Frodo said, "Yeah, he made that up. That was his." We're finding out a lot about Sam. Sam will surprise you before the end. "I am ready," said Frodo. "Let us go and look for the rest of the party." "I could take you to them, sir," said Sam. "It's a big house, this, and very peculiar. Always a bit more to discover, and no knowing what you'll find around a corner. And elves, sir, elves here and elves there. Some like kings, terrible and splendid, and some as merry as children. And the music and the singing. Not that I've had the time or the heart for much listening since we got here, but I'm getting to know some of the ways of the place." Gandalf, Aragorn, and Sam? Yeah. For me, definitely, Aragorn's fantastic, but Gandalf and Sam being my favorite from The Lord of the Rings. And then from the overall Legendarium tour is a big favorite of mine. That's Elrond's grandfather. One of his grandfathers. His other grandfather being Turgon. "I know what you've been doing, Sam," said Frodo, taking his arm. "But you shall be merry tonight and listen to your heart's content. Come on, guide me round the corners." Sam led him along several passages and down many steps, and out into a high garden above the steep bank of the river. He found his friends sitting at a porch on the side of the house looking east. Shadows had fallen in the valley below, but there was still a light on the faces of the mountains far above. The air was warm, the sound of running and falling water was loud, and the evening was filled with a faint scent of trees and flowers, as if summer still lingered in Elrond's gardens. "Hooray!" cried Pippin, springing up. "Here is our noble cousin! Make way for Frodo, Lord of the Ring!" "Hush!" said Gandalf from the shadows at the back of the porch. "Evil things do not come into this valley. But all the same, we should not name them. The Lord of the Ring is not Frodo, but the master of the Dark Tower of Mordor, whose power is again stretching out over the world. We are sitting in a fortress. Outside it's getting dark." "Gandalf has been saying many cheerful things like that," said Pippin. "He thinks I need keeping in order. But it seems impossible somehow to feel gloomy or depressed in this place. I feel I could sing if I knew the right song for the occasion." "I feel like singing myself," said Frodo. "Though at the moment I feel more like eating and drinking." "That will soon be cured," said Pippin. "You have shown your usual cunning in getting up just in time for a meal." "More than a meal, a feast," said Merry. As soon as Gandalf reported that you were recovered, the preparations began. He had hardly finished speaking when they were summoned to the hall by the ringing of many bells. The hall of Elrond's house was filled with folk, elves for the most part, though there were a few guests of other sorts. Elrond, as was his custom, sat in a great chair at the end of the long table upon the dais, and next to him, on the one side, sat Glorfindel, on the other side sat Gandalf. Frodo looked at them in wonder, for he had never before seen Elrond, of which so many tales spoke. And as they sat upon his right hand and his left, Glorfindel, and even Gandalf, whom he thought he knew so well, were revealed as lords of dignity and power. W.T. makes an excellent point. Everybody wants a friend like Sam, while forgetting how important it is to try to be Sam for somebody else. While I do say that everybody deserves a friend like Sam, but he's also an ideal that we should strive for. We should try to be Sam. And it's interesting, there's sort of this thought that when you're a child and you read The Lord of the Rings, a lot of children want to be Gimli. And then some go through this edgy adolescent phase where they want to be Sauron. And then they become teenagers and they want to be Aragorn. And then when you get older, you start looking at Gandalf and Sam instead as the ones to aspire to. Gandalf was shorter in stature than the other two, but his long white hair, his sweeping silver beard, and his broad shoulders made him look like some wise king of ancient legend. In his aged face, under the great snowy brows, his dark eyes were set like coals that could leap suddenly into fire. Glorfindel was tall and straight, his hair was of shining gold, his face fair and young and fearless and full of joy. His eyes were bright and keen, and his voice like music. On his brow sat wisdom, and in his hand was strength. The face of Elrond was ageless, neither old nor young, though it was written the memory of many things both glad and sorrowful. His hair was dark as the shadows of twilight, and upon it was set a circlet of silver. His eyes were grey and His eyes were grey as a clear evening, and in them was a light like the light of stars. Venerable he seemed as a king crowned with many winters, and yet hale as a tried warrior in the fullness of his strength. He was the Lord of Rivendell, and mighty among both elves and men. In the middle of the table, against the woven cloths upon the wall, there was a chair under a canopy, and there sat a fair lady to look upon. And so like was she in form of womanhood to Elrond that Frodo guessed that she was one of his close kindred. Young she was, and yet not so. The braids of her dark hair were touched by no frost. Her white arms and clear face were flawless and smooth, and the light of stars was in her eyes, grey as cloudless night. Yet queenly she looked, and thought and knowledge were in her glance, as of one who has known many things that the years bring. Above her brow her head was covered in a cap of silver lace netted with small gems, glittering white, but her soft grey raiment had no ornament save a girdle of leaves wrought in silver. So it was that Frodo saw her, whom few mortals had yet seen, Arwen, daughter of Elrond, in whom it was said that the likeness of Luthien had come on earth again, and she was called Undomiel, for she was the even star of her people. Long she had been in the land of her mother's kin, in Lorien beyond the mountains, and was but lately returned to Rivendell, to her father's house. But her brothers Elladan and Elrohir were out upon errantry, for they rode often far afield with the rangers of the north. forgetting never their mother's torment in the dens of the orcs. So here we have really the only real mention of Arwen's mother. They don't even say her name. Her name was Celebrian. And she's not around right now, you might notice. And what happened to Celebrian was actually really tragic. Now, if you've ever seen the film versions of The Hobbit, the ones that Peter Jackson made, they gave a lot of the backstory that Celebrian had to Thranduil's wife. Now, Thranduil certainly had a wife. We never learned her name or what became of her. She could have been drinking wine in the dungeon the whole time during The Hobbit, and we wouldn't have known that. Or she could have sailed to the west or been killed or something. We don't know. But anyway, a lot of that story wound up sort of extracted from Celebrian and given to this sort of new character. But what became of Elrond's wife, Celebrian? So Celebrian is actually Galadriel's daughter. And she was born sometime in the Third Age, and she met Elrond when he came to Lothlorien at some point, and they fell in love. And they became married, and they had twin sons, Elladan and Elrohir, and they had a daughter, Arwen. And then she was traveling through the Redhorn Pass, and she was captured by orcs. And she was taken into the caves, and she was tortured and poisoned. And Elladan and Elrohir went out, and they rescued her. They killed all the orcs, and they brought her home, and Elrond healed her. But he could heal her body, just like he healed Frodo. He's an excellent healer, definitely the best healer in Middle-earth. But he couldn't heal her mind. She had been tortured. She had been poisoned. She had been brutalized. And she became disillusioned with Middle-earth, and she sailed to the west. And so she is somewhere in the Undying Lands, not to be reunited with her husband until he sails to the west, and never to be reunited with her daughter, because we know her daughter is going to become mortal and is going to marry Aragorn. And we don't really know about Elladan and Elrohir. They would have had to have made a choice. Now, let's talk about half-elves for a brief moment here. Normally, if an elf and a mortal have a child together, that child is mortal. Any drop of mortal blood overrides the immortal blood. You become mortal. And this is why, for example, Beren and Luthien had a son named Dior. He was mortal. However, there are those that are half-elves that have become immortal. And this is because, Dior died pretty young. He was in his 30s. But he had some children. And one of them was a daughter named Elwing, like I said. Now, she has some elvish ancestry because of Luthien, but she also has a lot of mortal ancestry. She's mortal. Now, there was another couple, Tur and Idril. Now, Idril's an elf. She was immortal. She was the princess of Gondolin. Tur, a mortal man. No immortal blood at all in his backstory. And Tur and Idril were wed, and they had a son named Yarendil. Yarendil has elvish ancestry, so he's also considered a half-elf, what they call the Perithel. Perithel literally means half-elven. Yarendil and Elwing, both Perithel, married each other. And they sailed to the west. Now, they weren't supposed to do that for two reasons. One, they're mortal. Mortals don't sail to the west. And another, it was actually completely banned at this point to sail to the west, and the Valar had put a veil, a mist around the Undying Lands, that any ships that came, you would get confused and you'd get all turned around. You probably went out to sea and died. You never reached them. But they had a Silmaril, and the Silmaril cut through the veil, and they came to the Undying Lands. And then there was a bit of an argument about what was to become of them. They weren't supposed to be there. But Manwë, the king of the world, was very merciful. And he said, well, they do have elvish ancestry. And even though we banned the Noldor for coming back, they were not among their numbers. And they came here for a really good reason. But we must make them choose. So at this point, they had to choose whether to be mortal or immortal. And Elwing, immediately she wanted to be an elf. She wanted to be immortal. And so it was so. Jarundil actually had it in his heart. He wanted to be mortal. But now he realized that if he's mortal and he dies, he's going to be forever separated from his wife. He'll never see her again. He can't bear that. He needs to share the same fate as her, so he also becomes immortal. Now, they already had twin sons, Elrond and Elros. They were mortal, Perithel. And they were being raised by kidnappers back in Middle-earth. That's a story we'll get into at some other point. But they also had this choice now. It's not that all half-elves get this choice. It's those that are descended specifically from Jarundil and Elwing that have immortal blood in their recent memory. That's why another man and elf that came together in the Third Age, Mithril and Imrazor, their children were mortal. They didn't have any kind of choice. That's why Prince Imrahil, who we'll meet later in The Return of the King, there's a legend that says he has elven ancestry. Legolas looks at him and is like, yeah, that guy's got a little bit of elf in him for sure, but he's not immortal or anything like that. So it's specifically this line. Elrond chooses to be immortal. Elros chooses to be mortal. Elros marries a mortal. They found Numenor. They live a very long time. He lives to be like 500 years old when he finally dies. All of his ancestors have long lives, but not immortal lives. That's why Aragorn, he lives to be over 200 years old before he finally dies. So Elladan and Elrohir and Arwen all have this choice to make. But they sort of made an exception for them. They're functionally immortal. They don't age or anything. But they have to make this choice at some point, and the deadline for this choice is when Elrond leaves Middle-earth. Once Elrond sails to the west, they have to make their choice. And we know what Arwen's choice was, but we don't know what Elladan and Elrohir's choice is. And it's sort of like a big thing in fan fiction and a big thing to argue about. Did they become mortal? Did they become immortal or stay immortal and then sail to the west at a later date? We don't really know. We know that they stayed in Middle-earth at that point, but we don't know what their choice was. That's one of the things that Tolkien sort of just never told us. But anyway, that's a little bit about Celebrian and Elrond and their children. Of course, Celebrian didn't have to make any kind of choice. She was just an elf. Like I said, her parents were Galadriel and Celeborn, so she was just immortal. So the idea of an elf giving up their immortality is not a thing that any elf can do. Luthien did it. And Arwen is able to do it. Arwen is able to do it because of, her grandparents, Jarundil and Elwing. Luthien was a different sort of thing. Luthien and Tuor, I mentioned Tuor earlier, Tuor who married Idril. Tuor is the only mortal man who had no elvish ancestry who became immortal. And Luthien is the only elf. She had no ancestry from mortals. She had some ancestry from angels, but no from mortals, that became mortal. And in one of his letters, Tolkien said that they are two sides of the same coin, where God himself, Iluvatar, made an exception. And it's the only time that that's ever happened in either direction. All right, let's continue here, because I'll talk about Tuor for days. Such loveliness and living thing Frodo had never seen before nor imagined in his mind, and he was both surprised and abashed to find that he had a seat at Elrond's table among all these folk so high and fair. Though he had a suitable chair and was raised upon several cushions, he felt very small and rather out of place, but that feeling quickly passed. The feast was merry, and the food all that his hunger could desire. It was some time before he looked about him again, or even turned to his neighbors. He looked first for his friends. Sam had begged to be allowed to wait on his master, but had been told that for this time he was a guest of honor. Frodo could see him now, sitting with Pippin and Merry at the upper end of one of the side tables close to the dais. He could see no sign of Strider. Next to Frodo on his right sat a dwarf of important appearance, richly dressed. His beard, very long and forked, was white, nearly as white as the snow-white cloth of his garments. He wore a silver belt, and round his neck hung a chain of silver and diamonds. Frodo stopped eating to look at him. "Welcome, and well met," said the dwarf, turning toward him. Then he actually rose from his seat and bowed. "Gloin at your service," he said, and bowed still lower. "Frodo Baggins at your service and your family's," said Frodo correctly, rising in surprise and scattering his cushions. "Am I right in guessing that you are the Gloin, one of the 12 companions of the great Thorn Oakenshield?" "Quite right," answered the dwarf, gathering up the cushions and courteously assisting Frodo back to his seat. "And I do not ask, for I have already been told that you are the kinsman and adopted heir of our friend Bilbo the Renowned. Allow me to congratulate you on your recovery." "Thank you very much," said Frodo. "You've had some very strange adventures, I hear," said Gloin. "I wonder greatly what brings 4 hobbits on so long a journey. Nothing like it has happened since Bilbo came with us. But perhaps I should not inquire too closely, since Elrond and Gandalf do not seem disposed to talk of this." "I think we will not speak of it, at least not yet," said Frodo politely. He guessed that even in Elrond's house the matter of the ring was not one for casual talk, and in any case he wished to forget his troubles for a time. "But I am equally curious," he added, "to learn what brings so important a dwarf so far from the Lonely Mountain." Gloin looked at him. "If you have not heard, I think we will not speak yet of that either. Master Elrond will summon us ere long, I believe, and then we shall all hear many things, but there is much else that may be told." Throughout the rest of the meal they talked together, but Frodo listened more than he spoke, for the news of the Shire, apart from the ring, seemed small and far away and unimportant, and while Gloin had much to tell of events in the northern regions of Wilderland, Frodo learned that Grimbeorn the Old, son of Beorn, was now lord of many sturdy men, and to their land between the mountains of Mirkwood neither orc nor wolf dared to go. "Indeed," said Gloin, "if it were not for the Beornings, the passage from Dale to Rivendell would long ago have become impassable. They are valiant men, and keep open the high pass and the ford of Carrick. But their tolls are high," he added with a shake of his head, "and like Beorn of old, they are not over-fond of dwarves. Still they are trusty, and that is much in these days. Nowhere are there many men so friendly to us as the men of Dale. They are good folk, the Bardlings. The grandson of Bard the Bowman rules them, Bran, son of Bane, son of Bard. He is a strong king, and his realm now reaches far south and east of Esgaroth." Thank you, Zaldaman. "And what of your own people?" asked Frodo. "There is much to tell, good and bad," said Gloin. "Yet it is mostly good. We have so far been fortunate, though we do not escape the shadow of these times. If you really wish to hear of us, I will tell you tidings gladly. But stop me when you are weary. Dwarves' tongues run on when speaking of their handiwork, they say." And with that Gloin embarked upon a long account of the doings of the dwarf kingdom. He was delighted to have found so polite a listener, for Frodo showed no sign of weariness, and made no attempt to change the subject, though actually he soon got rather lost among the strange names of people and places that he had never heard of before. He was interested, however, to hear that Dain was still king under the mountain, and was now old, having passed his 250th year, venerable and fabulously rich. Of the 10 companions who had survived the Battle of 5 Armies, 7 were still with him: Dwalin, Gloin, Dori, Nori, Bifur, Bofor, and Bombur. Bombur was now so fat that he could not move himself from his couch to his chair at table, and it took 6 young dwarves to lift him. "And what has become of Balin and Ori and Oin?" asked Frodo. A shadow passed over Gloin's face. "We do not know," he answered. "It is largely on account of Balin that I have come to ask the advice of those that dwell in Rivendell. But tonight let us speak of merrier things." Gloin then began to talk of the works of his people, telling Frodo about the great labours in Dale and under the mountain. "We have done well," he said, "but in metalwork we cannot rival our fathers, many of whose secrets were lost. We make good armor and keen swords, but we cannot again make mail or blade to match those that were made during before the dragon came. Only in mining and building have we surpassed the old days. You should see the waterways of Dale, Frodo, and the mountains and the pools. You should see the stone-paved roads of many colours, and the halls and cavernous streets of the earth, and arches carved like trees, and the terraces and towers upon the mountain sides. Then you would see that we have not been idle." "I will come and see them if ever I can," said Frodo. "How surprised Bilbo would have been to see all the changes in the desolation of Smaug." Gloin looked at Frodo and smiled. "You were very fond of Bilbo, were you not?" he asked. "Yes," said Frodo. "I would rather see him than all the towers and the palaces in the world." At length the feast came to an end. Elrond and Arwen rose and went down the hall, and the company followed them in due order. The doors were thrown open, and they went across a wide passage and through other doors, and came into a further hall. In it were no tables, but a bright fire was burning in a great hearth beneath the cavern, pillars on either side. Frodo found himself walking with Gandalf. "This is the Hall of Fire," said the wizard. "Here you will hear many songs and tales, if you can keep awake. But except on high days, it usually stands empty and quiet, and people come here who wish for peace and thought. There is always a fire here all year round, but there is little other light." As Elrond entered and went toward the seat prepared for him, elvish minstrels began to make sweet music. Slowly the hall filled, and Frodo looked with delight upon the many fair faces that were gathered together. The golden firelight played upon them and shimmered in their hair. Suddenly he noticed, not far from the further end of the fire, a small, dark figure, seated on a stool with his back propped up against a pillar. Beside him on the ground was a drinking cup and some bread. Frodo wondered whether he was ill, if people were ever ill in Rivendell, and had been unable to come to the feast. His head seemed sunk in sleep on his breast, and a fold of his dark cloak was drawn over his face. Elrond went forward and stood beside the silent figure. "Awake, little master," he said with a smile. Then, turning to Frodo, he beckoned to him. "Now at last the hour has come that you have wished for, Frodo," he said. "Here is a friend that you have long missed." I have to drink water. I need more than that. The dark figure raised his head and uncovered its face. "Bilbo!" cried Frodo with sudden recognition, and he sprang forward. "Hello, Frodo, my lad," said Bilbo. "So you've got here at last. I hoped you would manage it. Well, all this feasting is in your honor, I hear. I hope you enjoyed yourself." "Why weren't you there?" cried Frodo. "And why haven't I been allowed to see you before?" "Because you were asleep. I have seen a good deal of you. I have sat by your side with Sam each day. But as for the feast, I don't go in for such things much now. And I have something else to do." "What were you doing?" "Sitting and thinking. I do a lot of that nowadays, and this is the best place to do it, as a rule." "Wake up, indeed," he said, cocking an eye at Elrond. There was a bright twinkle in it, and no sign of sleepiness that Frodo could see. "Wake up. I was not asleep, Master Elrond." "If you want to know, you have all come out from your feast too soon, and you have disturbed me, in the middle of making up a song." I was stuck over a line or two, and I was thinking about them. But now I don't suppose I shall ever get them right. There'll be such a deal of singing that the ideas will be driven clean out of my head. I shall have to get my friend the Dunedain to help me. Where is he?" Elrond laughed. "He shall be found," he said. "Then you two shall go into a corner and finish your task, and we will hear it and judge it before we end our merrymaking." Messengers were sent to find Bilbo's friend, though none knew where he was or why he had not been present at the feast. In the meanwhile, Frodo and Bilbo sat side by side, and Sam came quickly and placed himself near them. They talked together in soft voices, oblivious of the mirth and music in the hall about them. Bilbo had not much to say of himself. When he had left Hobbiton, he had wandered off aimlessly along the road or in country on either side, but somehow he had steered all the time toward Rivendell. "I got here without much adventure," he said, "and after a rest I went on with the dwarves to Dale, my last journey. I shan't travel again. Old Balin has gone away. Then I came back here, and here I have been. I have done this and that. I have written some more of my book, and of course I made up a few songs. They sing them occasionally, just to please me, I think. Of course they aren't really good enough for Rivendell. And I listen and I think. Time doesn't seem to pass here. It just is. A remarkable place altogether. I hear all kinds of news from over the mountains and out of the south, but hardly anything from the Shire. I heard about the ring, of course. Gandalf has been here often. Not that he has told me a great deal. But it has become close. He has become closer than ever these last few years. The Dunedain has told me more. Fancy that ring of mine causing such a disturbance. It is a pity that Gandalf did not find out more sooner. I could have brought the thing here myself long ago without so much trouble. I have thought several times of going back to Hobbiton for it, but I'm getting old. And they would not let me. Gandalf and Elrond, I mean. They seemed to think that the enemy was looking high and low for me, and would make mincemeat of me if he caught me tottering about in the wild. And Gandalf said, the ring is passed on Bilbo. It would do no good to you or others if you tried to meddle with it again. Odd sort of remark, just like Gandalf. But he said he was looking after you, so I let things be. I'm frightfully glad to see you safe and sound. He paused and looked at Frodo doubtfully. Have you got it here? He asked in a whisper. I can't help feeling curious, after all I've heard. I should very much like to peep at it again. Yes, I've got it, answered Frodo, feeling a strange reluctance. It looks the same as it ever did. Well, I should like to see it for a moment, said Bilbo. When he had dressed, Frodo had found that while he slept the ring had been hung about his neck on a new chain, light but strong. Slowly he drew it out. Bilbo put out his hand, but Frodo quickly drew back the ring. To his distress and amazement, he found that he was no longer looking at Bilbo. A shadow seemed to have fallen between them, and through it he found himself eyeing a little wrinkled creature with a hungry face and bony, groping hands. He felt a desire to strike him. So let me pause here. This is the scene that in the film was the scary Bilbo, where he sort of lunges at Frodo. He sort of becomes like Gollum. And even though it was interesting to see that, and kind of like everybody in the theater, whoa, Bilbo's going crazy. It was a bit of a misinterpretation of what's actually happening here. Bilbo doesn't change. Frodo does. Frodo sees Bilbo this way because of the ring. The ring is making him see Bilbo as a creature and filling him with the urge to strike him away from him. This happens a lot later when they're in Mordor, when Sam has the ring. And, actually, he had just given back to Frodo. And Frodo actually sees Sam as an orc, because it can alter your perception. The other thing that I want to mention here, it's just flown out of my head. Oh dear. I guess it wasn't all that important. There was something else that I was sort of waiting for a good spot to stop, and I don't remember what it was, so we'll just have to continue then. The music and singing round them seemed to falter, and a silence fell. Bilbo looked quickly at Frodo's face and passed his hand across his eyes. I understand now, he said. Put it away. I am sorry. Sorry you have come in for this burden. Sorry about everything. Don't adventures ever have an end? I suppose not. Everyone else always has to carry on the story. Well, it can't be helped. I wonder if it's any good trying to finish my book. But let's worry about it now. Let's have some real news. Tell me all about the Shire. Frodo I'm sorry. I just remembered what it was. So, Frodo awoke and found the ring on a chain around his neck. And a lot of people always ask me, well, who did that? Who made the chain? And more importantly, who handled the ring? And I think the chain was probably made by Elrond, but I think the person who actually was able to touch the ring, because it certainly wouldn't have been Gandalf. Gandalf's already touched it once. He won't touch it again. I think it had to have been Glorfindel. And the reason I think that it had to be Glorfindel is because he's sort of the most trustworthy one, in the terms that he has a lot of power, and it's a very pure sort of power. The ring wouldn't want to be with him. So I always thought that it had to have been Glorfindel, although I also like to imagine them like sort of handling the ring with tongs, although you don't have to touch it for it to affect you. Just ask Boromir. Okay, now we'll continue. I'm glad I remembered that. Frodo hid the ring away, and the shadow passed, leaving hardly a shred of memory. The light and music of Rivendell was about him again. Bilbo smiled and laughed happily. Every item of news from the Shire that Frodo could tell, aided and corrected now and again by Sam, was of the greatest interest to him, from the felling of the least tree to the pranks of the smallest child in Hobbiton. They were so deep in the doings of the Four-Farthings that they did not notice the arrival of a man clad in dark green cloth. For many minutes he stood looking down at them with a smile. Suddenly Bilbo looked up at last. "Ah, there you are at last, Dunedain," he cried. "Strider," said Frodo. "You seem to have a lot of names." "Well, Strider is one that I haven't heard before anyway," said Bilbo. "What do you call him that for?" "They call me that in Bree," said Strider, laughing. "And that is how I was introduced to him." "And why do you call him Dunedain?" asked Frodo. "The Dunedain," said Bilbo. "He is often called that here. But I thought you knew enough Elvish at least to know Dunedain, man of the West, Númenórean. But this is not the time for lessons." He turned to Strider. "Where have you been, my friend? Why weren't you at the feast? The Lady Arwen was there." Strider looked down at Bilbo gravely. "I know," he said, "but often I must put mirth aside. Elladan and Elrond here have returned out of the wild unlooked for, and they had tidings I wish to hear at once." Special elvish blacksmith tongs. Yeah, that is what I like to imagine in my head. Like I said, though, that wouldn't actually protect you from the powers of the ring, but it's a funny sort of thought, that they would be handling it the way that you would imagine somebody would handle, like, plutonium or something. Well, my dear fellow, said Bilbo, now you've heard the news, can't you spare me a moment? I want your help in something urgent. Elrond says this song of mine is to be finished before the end of the evening, and I am stuck. Let us go off in a corner and polish it up. Strider smiled. Come then, he said, let me hear it. Frodo was left to himself for a while, for Sam had fallen asleep. He was alone, and felt rather forlorn, although all about him the folk of Rivendell were gathered. But those near him were silent, intent upon the music of the voices and the instruments, and they gave no heed to anything else. Frodo began to listen. At first the beauty of the melodies and the interwoven words in the elven tongue, even though he understood them little, held him in a spell. As soon he began to attend to them. Almost it seemed that the words took shape, and visions of far lands and bright things that he had never yet imagined opened out before him, and the firelit hall became like a golden mist above seas of foam that sighed upon the margins of the world. Then the enchantment became more and more dreamlike, until he felt that an endless river of swelling gold and silver was flowing over him, too multitudinous for its pattern to be comprehended. It became part of the throbbing air about him, and it drenched and drowned him. Swiftly he sank under its shining weight into a deep realm of sleep. There he wandered long in a dream of music that turned into running water, and suddenly into a voice. It seemed to be the voice of Bilbo chanting verses, faint at first, then clearer ran the words. Jorindil was a mariner that tarried in Avernion. He built a boat of timber felled in Nimberthil to journey in. Her sails he wove of silver fail, of silver were her lanterns made. Her prow was fashioned like a swan, and light upon her banners laid. In panoply of ancient kings he claimed rings, he armoured him. His shining shield was scored with runes to ward all wounds and harm from him. His bow was made of dragon horn, his arrows shorn of ebony. Of silver was his habergeon, his scabbard of Chakondany. His sword of steel was valiant, of adamant his helmet tall. An eagle plume upon his crest, upon his breast an emerald. Beneath the moon and under star he wandered far from northern strands, bewildered on enchanted ways, beyond the days of mortal lands. From gnashing of the narrow ice, where shadows lie on frozen hill, and neither heats and burning waste, he turned to haste, and roving still, on starless waters far astray, at last he came to night of naught, and passed, and never sight he sought of shining shone, nor light he sought. The winds of wrath came driving him, and blindly in the foam he fled. From west to east and errandless, unheralded, he homeward sped. There flying Elwing came to him, and flame was in the darkness lit, more bright than light of diamond, the fire upon her carcanet. The Silmaril she bound on him, and crowned him with the living light, and dauntless then with burning brow he turned his prow, and in the night, from other world beyond the sea, there strong and free a storm arose, a wind of power in Tarmanel, by paths that seldom mortal goes. His boat it bore with biting breath, as might of death across the grey, and long forsaken seas distressed, from east to west he passed away. Through even night his back was borne, on black and roaring waves that ran, o'er leagues unlit and foundered shores that drowned before the days began, until he hears on strands of pearl, where ends the world, the music long, wherever foaming billows roll, the yellow gold and jewels wan. He saw the mountains silent rise, where twilight lies upon the knees of Valinor and Eldamar, beheld afar beyond the seas. A wanderer escaped from night, a haven white he came at last, to elven home, the green and fair, where keen the air, where pale as glass, beneath the hill of Ilmarin, a glimmer in a valley sheer, the lamplit towers of Tirion are mirrored on the Shadowmere. He towered there from errantry, and melodies they taught to him, and sages old him marvels told, and harps of gold they brought to him. They clothed him then in elven white, and 7 lights before him sent, as though the Calkyrian to hidden land forlorn he went. He came upon the timeless halls, where shining fall the countless years, and endless reigns the elder king, in Ilmarin on mountain sheer. And words unheard were spoken then, of folk and men and elvenkin, before the world where vision shone, forbid to those that dwell therein. A ship then new was built for him, of mithril and of elven glass, With shining prow, no shaven oar, nor sail she bore on silver mast, the Silmaril as lantern light, and banner bright with living flame, to gleam thereon by Elbereth herself was set, who thither came, and wings immortal made for him, and laid on him undying doom, to sail the shoreless skies, and come behind the sun and light of moon. From Evercorn's lofty hills, where softly silver fountains fall, his wings him bore a wandering light beyond the mighty mountain's wall. From world's end there he turned away, and yearned again to find afar his home, through shadows journeying and burning as an island star. As high above the mists he came, a distant flame before the sun, a wonder ere the waking dawn, where grey the Norland waters run. And over Middle-earth he passed, and heard at last the weeping sore of women and of elven maids, in elva days and years of lore. But on him mighty doom was laid, till moon should fade and Orbit store to pass, and tarry nevermore. On hither shores where mortals are, for ever still herald on, an errand that should never rest, to bear his shining lamp afar, the Flamafir of Westerness. So let me pause here and talk a little bit about this. Now, I actually already told the story of Yarendil and Elwing sailing to the west. And of course, I didn't go into the mithril ship because that's to do with the War of Wrath and such, and I was mostly talking about their doom and their children's doom. And of course, this mentions another doom, to sail the sky, to become a star in the sky. And there's several points where they say, there is Earendil in the sky, this light. And it's the light of the Silmaril, and it's literally Elrond's dad up there in a ship holding the Silmaril. And of course, we understand this light as being Venus now, which is interesting, the light of Venus. But in Tolkien's world, it's literally Elrond's dad in a ship with a Silmaril, and sometimes his wife Elwing joins him. Well, when Tolkien uses the word doom, what he really means is destiny. So Mount Doom is sort of the English translation of what the mountain is called in Gondor. They called it Amon Amarth, which means Mount Doom. The elves call it Urodrin, which just means Red Mountain. So there you have it. The other thing to mention, speaking of stars and constellations and things like that, the 7 lights before him sent as though the Kalakirian. So Kalakirian is sort of referring to something called the Valakirka, which is called a lot of other things in a lot of other cultures. It's 7 stars, and you'll notice that 7 stars comes up a lot in the iconography of Middle-earth. And, you know, it's also called the Wain, the Bear, a whole bunch of different things. It's a constellation. We call it the Big Dipper, but it's really important to, like, every culture in Middle-earth. The dwarves, for example, call it Durin's Crown. There's a part later on, a little bit about Durin's Crown. It is getting kind of late, so we're going to finish this chapter, and then we're going to stop. We only got through 2 chapters, but they're kind of 2 of the longer chapters in The Lord of the Rings. And I mean, next time, we have the chapter, The Council of Elrond, which is actually the longest chapter in The Lord of the Rings. There's just so much to go over there. But anyway, let's finish this chapter. There's only about 2.5 pages left. The chanting ceased. Frodo opened his eyes and saw that Bilbo was seated upon his stool in a circle of listeners who were smiling and applauding. "Now we had better have it again," said an elf. Bilbo got up and bowed. "I am flattered, Lindir," he said, "but it would be too tiring to repeat it all." "Not too tiring for you," the elves answered, laughing. "You know you are never tired of reciting your own verses. But really, we cannot answer your question on one hearing." "What?" cried Bilbo. "You can't tell which parts were mine and which were the Dúnedain's?" "It is not easy for us to tell the difference between 2 mortals," said the elf. "Nonsense, Lindir," snorted Bilbo. "If you can't distinguish between a man and a hobbit, your judgment is poorer than I imagined. They're as different as peas and apples." "Maybe. To sheep, other sheep, no doubt, appear different," laughed Lindir. "Or to shepherds. But mortals have not been our study. We have other business." "I won't argue with you," said Bilbo. "I am sleepy after so much music and singing. I'll leave you to guess if you want to." He got up and came toward Frodo. "Well, that's over," he said in a low voice. "It went off better than I expected. I don't often get asked for a second hearing. What did you think of it?" "I'm not going to try to guess," said Frodo, smiling. You needn't, said Bilbo. As a matter of fact, it was all mine, except that Aragorn insisted on my putting in a green stone. He seemed to think it important. I don't know why. Otherwise, he obviously thought the whole thing rather above my head, and he said that if I had to check to make verses about Earendil in the House of Elrond, it was my affair. I suppose he was right. No, if I had the cheek. Okay, so let me talk about this, because Bilbo says two really crazy things here that have a lot of meaning. One is that Aragorn sort of admonishes Bilbo, saying it's cheeky to sing about Earendil in Elrond's house, and you might wonder why. And it's kind of a sore subject, really. Like I mentioned it earlier, Earendil is Elrond's father, but Elrond was not raised by his parents, Earendil and Elwing. They left when he was very, very young. They fought in the... Well, Earendil fought in the War of Wrath, but he was forbidden to actually walk amongst the peoples of Middle-earth at this point. He had to stay in his flying ship the whole time, and now he's in the sky. So the thing is that Elrond was actually, like I mentioned it earlier, raised by kidnappers. These two guys named Mathros and Maglor. And they kidnapped Elrond and his brother and raised them. And they weren't good people, by the way. They were homicidal maniacs. But they did have a soft spot for Elrond and Elros. That was sort of like the only really good thing that they did, other than the fact that they were fighting Morgoth. Not everybody that fought Morgoth was good. Morgoth is Satan, you know? And not everybody who is against Satan is a good person. And we see this reflected in The Lord of the Rings. Saruman is against Sauron, but he's not good, you know? He's trying to defeat Saruman in his own sort of bizarre way. And we'll hear a lot about that in the next chapter, which is going to have to happen at some other point. The other thing that's interesting here is that the only contribution to the poem that Aragorn had was that he insisted a green stone be put into it. That Earendil carried a green stone to the Undying Lands. And this is a real stone, and it was called the Elisar. And the Elisar was made by an elf named Celebrimbor. Now, Celebrimbor was a really important elf that had a colony called Eregion. It was also called Holland. And it was right outside of Moria. And this is where the greatest of all the elven smiths lived, because they learned from the dwarves, and the dwarves learned from them, and they were in great friendship with the dwarves. But this is where Sauron came, and this is where the Rings of Power were made. So Celebrimbor had a hand in making many of the Rings in Power, and he specifically did make 3 of them, which became Vilya, Nenya, and Narya, which he gave to... Well, he gave one to Galadriel, who he was in love with. Of course, she was married, so that's out of his league. And the other 2 he gave to Gil-galad. Gil-galad gave one to Círdan, and that was the original bearers of the 3. And of course, Gil-galad gave his ring to Elrond, and Círdan gave his ring to Gandalf. But anyway, Celebrimbor also made the Elisar, which was this green gem. This was back in the First Age, before the Rings of Power. And it was this magic gem that could heal. And it passed hands a few times, but it wound up with Earendil, and Earendil took it with him to the Undying Lands, and it never came back. Or so did it. So, at some point, another Elisar appears. And actually, right now, Aragorn has it. Now, we don't know whether it's the original Elisar or a copy. Now, there's sort of 2 versions of the story. Tolkien wrote 2 explanations for how Aragorn could have the Elisar when we know that Earendil took it into the West. One is that it's not the same gem. It was a copy made by Celebrimbor as a gift to Galadriel, because at some point Galadriel was not able to use her Ring of Power because of Sauron and the One Ring, so he gave her the gem to sort of hold her over, you know, so that she could protect her realm from evil forces using this gem. The other version of the story is that Gandalf actually brought the original gem back to Middle-earth. And this is the one that I prefer because it involves a bit of prophecy, in that Gandalf gave the gem to Galadriel and told her she will one day give it to the man who will become the king of the reunited kingdom of Gondor and Arnor. And it didn't always stay with Galadriel. At some point, she gave it to her daughter, Celebrian, and Celebrian gave it to Arwen. But at some point, Arwen handed it back to Galadriel, back to her grandmother, and told her to give it to Aragorn, because she had met Aragorn and she knew this was the guy. So, like I said, that's the Green Stone, and it means a lot to Aragorn. It's the Elisar. He has two things on him that are incredibly old and important. His ring. It's not a ring of power. It's called the Ring of Barahir, but it's one of the oldest things in Middle-earth. Barahir is an ancestor far, far, far back. You didn't know that Arwen's grandmother was Galadriel? Yeah. Galadriel and Celeborn had, in the original, early drafts, they had two children. One was named Amroth, and the other was Celebrian. Amroth wound up getting written out. Well, he didn't get written out, but he became changed to a completely different character that wasn't related to Galadriel. He was the original king of Lothlorien. But yeah, Celebrian married Elrond, and they had 3 children together, and that's where Arwen comes from. But anyway, so this gem has been around. It's been to the Undying Lands and back, or maybe not. Maybe it's a copy that Celebrimbor made, but I prefer the version that Gandalf brought it back from the Undying Lands. And of course, those different versions are in Unfinished Tales. You could read them because Tolkien wrote a lot about the backstory of Galadriel, and he had all these different versions of her that they're all in conflict with each other because he couldn't make up his mind. He had created her for the Lord of the Rings, but realized that in creating such an old character that was so important that she absolutely had to be a part of the Silmarillion, and he had to find a way to give her a backstory that lived up to the character, but he never finished it. Why was Gandalf and Galadriel so buddy-buddy in the movies? They're friends. They're very, very good friends. They've known each other for a very long time. I actually wrote a thing on Quora not too long ago about did they ever meet in Valinor, and I said, well, no, Gandalf was really shy. When he was a Loren, he would walk amongst the elves, but he would disguise himself in his elf, or he would just be completely invisible, and he would give them fair dreams and visions. But it's interesting, though, that the word Lorien is related to dreams. And the word Olorin, notice the similarities. Lorien, Olorin. Olorin is Gandalf's real name. Lorien is the name of a realm in the Undying Lands, but also a name of a realm in Middle-earth, shortened form of Lothlorien, which translates to a dream of the flowers. We'll get into the Lothlorien and the translations when we read The Two Towers, because Treebeard has a lot to say about it. But notice the similation. They come from Olor, which means dream, in Quenya. And I've always interpreted Olorin as meaning dreamer, but notice there's a similarity, and I've always thought, yes, there's definitely a connection between Galadriel and Gandalf. He definitely talked to her. She may not have known it, but he spoke to her. He gave her dreams and visions. He gave her fair wisdom. There's no doubt in my mind about that. Just the fact that she named her realm Lorien tells me that, because he was a student of many of the Valar, of Nienna, of Varda, of Ermo, who was also called Lorien, and of Manwë himself. But of course, Nienna was the most important. She was the one that taught him patience, pity, mercy. But yeah, that's why they're so close. They're really, really, they've known each other for thousands of years. Even if it was only in Middle-earth, they've known each other for over 2 millennia. So they've become close. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you a little bit of lore here, Zelda Man. When the White Council was actually started by Galadriel. But when the wizards came, there's 5 of them. 2 of them made themselves scarce early on. They went into the lands to the east and the south. So there's these 3 guys. You have Saruman and Gandalf and Radagast. And Galadriel, she's the leader, right? She created the White Council. She chose Gandalf to be her replacement. And that made Saruman really upset. He insisted he's the boss. he's above Gandalf. He's got to be the leader. He's got to lead the White Council. Of course, Gandalf's like, well, go ahead, have at it, He doesn't care. He knows Saruman's got a Saruman, But yeah, she's always perceived that Gandalf was the important one. And when Gandalf dies, when she gets news that he had died, she has this foresight to send Gwaihir to the mountain of Ziraxagil and bring Gandalf back to her. And as the eagle comes and grabs his body, he's coming back to life. And when Gandalf comes to Lorien, she has white robes and a new staff ready for him. She knew. So, yeah. You felt like they dated in The Hobbit? There was a little bit of weirdness in the Hobbit movies, but you have to remember she does have a husband, Celeborn. He's right there the whole time, And there was a great love story of Galadriel and Celeborn, a few different versions of it. She does love him. She loves Gandalf too, just in a different way. They're just close friends. They didn't date. Gandalf, there's no romance in his life that we know of. You know what I mean? Like, if anything, maybe he has an angel girlfriend back home, but I just don't really see it, considering how shy he is. Of course, when he sails back to the West at the beginning of the Fourth Age, with Frodo and Bilbo and Elrond and Galadriel and Gildor and Glorien, he's a big hero. He's going to have women all over him at that point. All right, let's finish this chapter. Let's see, where was I? Oh, the Green Stone, yes. I don't know, said Frodo. It seemed to me to fit somehow, though I can't explain. I was half asleep when you begun, and it seemed to follow up on something that I was dreaming about. I didn't understand that it was really you speaking until near the end. It is difficult to keep awake here until you get used to it, said Bilbo. Not that hobbits would ever acquire quite the elvish appetite for music and poetry and tales. They seem to like them as much as food, or more. They will be going on for a long time yet. What do you say to slipping off for some more quiet talk? Can we? Said Frodo. Of course. This is merrymaking, not business. Come and go as you like, as long as you don't make a noise. They got up and withdrew quietly into the shadows and made for the doors. Sam they left behind, fast asleep still with a smile on his face. In spite of his delight in Bilbo's company, Frodo felt a tug of regret as they passed out of the Hall of Fire. Even as they stepped over the threshold, a single clear voice rose in song. Ah, Ilberith Githoniel, Silvarin Penamiriel, O Menelaglar Elanath, Na Chared Palandiriel, O Galathrenin Enoroth, Falil Silenathon Elf Na... Oh, I messed up that last line. Nephayar Sin Afaral. Frodo halted for a moment, looking back. Elrond was in his chair, and the fire was on his face like summer light upon the trees. Near him sat the Lady Arwen. To his surprise, Frodo saw that Aragorn stood beside her. His dark cloak was thrown back, and he seemed to be clad in elven mail, and a star shone on his breast. They spoke together, and then suddenly it seemed to Frodo that Arwen turned toward him, and the light of her eyes fell upon him from afar and pierced his heart. He stood still enchanted, while the sweet syllables of the elvish song fell like clear jewels of blended word and melody. It is a song to Elbereth, said Bilbo. They will sing that and other songs of the Blessed Realm many times tonight. Come on. He led Frodo back to his own little room. It opened onto the gardens and looked south across the ravine of the Bruinen. There they sat for some while, looking through the window at the bright stars above the steep climbing woods and talking softly. They spoke no more of the small news of the Shire far away, nor of the dark shadows and perils that encompassed them, but of the fair things they had seen in the world together, of the elves, of the stars, of trees, and the gentle fall of the bright year of the woods. At last there came a knock upon the door. Begging your pardon, said Sam, putting in his head, but I was just wondering if you would be wanting anything. And begging yours, Sam Gamgee, replied Bilbo. I guess you mean that it is time your master went to bed. Well, sir, there is a council early tomorrow, I hear, and he only got up today for the first time. Quite right, Sam, laughed Bilbo. You can trot off and tell Gandalf that he has gone to bed. Good night, Frodo. Bless me, but it has been good to see you again. There are no folk like hobbits, after all, for a real good talk. I'm getting very old. and I begin to wonder if I should ever live to see your chapters of the story. Good night. I'll take a walk, I think, and look in the stars of Elbereth in the garden. Sleep well. So there's the end of that first chapter of Book 2, Many Meetings. So we only did get through 2 chapters, but like I said, they're sort of 2 of the longest chapters. Flight to the Fort is quite long, and then Many Meetings is long. The next chapter, the Council of Elrond, is even longer, but then they get shorter after that. See, the Council of Elrond starts on chapter 252 and goes on, let's see, until 284. So it's quite a lot, for a chapter in The Lord of the Rings. Anyway, it mentioned the stars of Elbereth, so it's interesting. Elbereth is the Sindarin name for Varda. Varda is the name of Elbereth and Quenya. There's multiple Elvish languages. And she is actually the one that created the stars, or at least most of them. So when the world was created, it was a song. The angels all sung the song together. God, Iluvatar, led them in musical themes, and they all sang with the themes, except for Melkor. He sang discordant themes. He sang against the music. This was the Einarlundala, which translates literally as Music of the Holy Ones, but is also known as the War of Music. They created the world, and they went down to it, and it was dark, and it was empty, and they had to create all the things that were supposed to be in the world, the Valar, that is, the Ainur. And they created light for the world in terms of these 2 lamps that lay upon 2 great towers, one in the north and one in the south. The world was flat at this point, and everything was lit. And then Melkor came in, and he destroyed the lights, so they had no light. And they took themselves off to the Undying Lands, and they left Middle-earth in darkness. Middle-earth was pretty empty. I mean, there were animals there, there were plants there, but the elves had not appeared yet. The men had not appeared yet. They were lying, slumbering in the earth to awaken at a date that they would not yet know. But Varda, Elbereth, knew that the elves were going to awake in darkness, and it really kind of made her sad. So she created extra stars. She filled the night sky with stars so that they would have some form of light. Because in the Undying Lands, they made the trees. The trees gave off a great amount of light. Lorelin, the gold, and Telperi, and the silver. And they became the day and night cycle, and how they told time, and how they had light in Aman, in the Undying Lands. But Middle-earth was dark. So she created that because she knew that the elves were going to awake at some point, and they had to be able to see. So that's why it's the stars of Elbereth. Elbereth is the Sindarin version. And if you're wondering why they're like 2 different languages, it's actually more than 2 different languages. When the elves first awoke, they first called themselves the Quendi. And that means speakers. Because they were, as far as they knew, the first beings to walk the land that could speak in voices and could create language. And the language that they spoke at that time was called Quendian, which just literally means talking. So, of course, what happened was they split. Their culture split. Some of them went to the west, some of them didn't. And the ones that went to the west they evolved a language into something that we call Quenya. Whereas the ones that stayed, not all of them, but a lot of them were called the Sindar. A great deal of them that stayed were called the Sindar. They were the followers of an elf named Iluthingol. And they created a language of their own called Sindarin. Now, in The Lord of the Rings, you'll notice that most of the Elvish is Sindarin. The elves all speak Sindarin. In Gondor, they speak Sindarin. Gondor actually has their own dialect of Sindarin called Gondor Sindarin. In Numenor, they spoke Sindarin. So Sindarin became really, really popular, whereas Quenya less so. And the reason is because when some of the Noldor came back to Middle-earth, they all spoke Quenya. But they were not so great people. They started doing kinslayings and all these horrible things. And Iluthingol, he wanted nothing to do with the Noldor. And he actually banned the Noldor from the Sindar realms. The only one that was allowed to be there was Galadriel, because she was somewhat related to him and he liked her. And I think her brother, Finrod, was allowed to be there as well. but nobody that was associated with Feanor or his people was allowed, and he actually banned the speaking of Quenya in his realm, which was a good part of Beleriand. So all the elves learned Sindarin, and they all felt that Quenya was sort of the better language, that it was prettier, but they learned Sindarin, and because they all had to communicate with each other, and Thingol was not going to speak Quenya. He was very stubborn, and he kind of had a little bit of a point, but he was taking it too far, Celeborn is like that too, in a way, which we'll see when we get to that part. But anyway, there are other languages. There's Telerin, there's the Avari dialects. Now, the Avari are the elves that refused to even start the journey, and the Avari dialects actually became the first languages that mortal men spoke, because the Avari, even though they refused to go to the Undying Lands, they didn't want to listen to Orome, they didn't want to go anywhere, they served an important purpose in the story. As a matter of fact, the purpose that the elves were supposed to do is that when mortal men first awakened, they taught them culture. So how did the men learn to speak? They learned from the Avari elves, and that became the languages that became things like Adunaic and Westron. And when we read in The Lord of the Rings, and we read words that are in English, they're representing the fictional language of Westron, which is also known as the common speech. It's called that because everybody in Middle-earth speaks Westron. Even the orcs can speak Westron. Even in The Hobbit, when Bilbo is talking to the spiders, he can understand the spiders because he's wearing the One Ring, and the One Ring doesn't just turn you invisible, it does a lot of different things, and one of the things is it lets you understand evil languages. So he can understand the spiders, Shelob's children. But what's interesting is they can understand him when he starts taunting them and insulting them and giving them little nicknames, and they get outraged and angry and start chasing the voices and everything. They know Westron. Everybody speaks Westron, and the root of that goes all the way back to the Avari elves. So yeah, just a little about Elvish. Now, as for learning to speak it, the thing is, you will never be fluent in any Elvish language because they're not completed languages. Sindarin especially is really incomplete. Quenya is close. Out of all the languages that Tolkien created, and he created a lot of constructed languages, Quenya is the closest, and as a matter of fact, a lot of people have tried to finish it on their own. It's sort of called like Neo-Quenya. If you speak Quenya properly, it will sound like you're speaking Finnish. It's not Finnish words, but the sound of it in your ears will sound like Finnish. And I actually was just talking to Barrel just yesterday, actually, because he's from Sweden, and I don't think he speaks Finnish, but he hears Finnish because, he's in Sweden. And I linked him to a video where I was speaking Quenya, and he said, oh, yeah, that sounds Finnish. And if you speak Sindarin properly, it should sound vaguely Welsh. And I'll tell you who has the most excellent Sindarin accent is the actress that played Arwen, Liv Tyler. When she was cast as... she was sort of like a big deal at the time. She was like the biggest name in The Lord of the Rings other than Christopher Lee. And there were a lot of like really not so nice stories about her that came out, like about how she couldn't learn the Elvish dialogue. It had to be spoon-fed to her line by line, and then later you find out that's all complete BS. She actually is really good at speaking Sindarin. And when she does it at conventions still, and she just sounds like an elf. She does it really well. Do I think I could teach you? I could help you with Quenya and pronouncing the words and trying to create sentences, but I'm not a fluent Quenya speaker. Nobody is a fluent Quenya speaker. Even Tolkien wasn't a fluent Quenya speaker. The best thing that I can tell you is you could try to track down as much as the Parma Eldalambran as you can. It was a language journal that Tolkien wrote in, and has a lot of Elvish words in it. But I could definitely coach you on pronunciation. That's like the biggest thing. Like, for example, I'm going to type a name into the chat, and I've actually already said this guy's name earlier because he was one of the 2 kidnappers that raised Elrond. And that name, if you see it, it's Maedhros. You might think, what, Maedhros? It's actually Mathros. So, and the reason that we know it's Mathros is from the pronunciation guide that's at the back of the Lord of the Rings, at the back of the Silmarillion, and it tells us it doesn't say his name and then it's Mathros. It tells you the AE. There's no sort of accents on them, so it's like a like cat, and then the DH is like a soft TH as in father. So Mathros. You want to impress your Lord of the Rings friend who plays a Magic the Gathering? Well, like I said, maybe you just learn a few phrases or just like read a little bit of the the Elbereth Chthoniel poetry or something like that. Like I said, if you notice, I'll just go over here really quick. We're sort of wrapping up stream, but if you notice, if I go over to the council screen where we have the Elvish names underneath us, I came up with all of those. And I actually offered on Quora and on YouTube to, if you wanted to know what your name in Elvish was, I could translate it for you. So people would say, "This is my name," and what I would do is I would look up what is the meaning of the name, and then how could I translate that to Elvish? So mine, we'll go back over here. Erulise comes from the fact that John means. You shall not pass. The John means God's grace. So God in the Lord of the Rings is either Eru, which means the one, or Iluvatar, which is all father. And in my case, in trying to come up with a name, I chose to use a prefix. So I use Eru, and then Lisse is grace. So Eru Lisse is John. And then Sierra means mountain, so that's an easy one. Oronti is mountain. Matt also means, it's similar to John. It means the gift of God. So in that case, I chose Anna, which is gift, and then Vatar from Iluvatar, meaning father, actually, but in relation to God. So that's where I come up with this. So each of these things, like Sid being Alcar Arato, their translation. So there's a I shouldn't be over here. Actually, I'll tell you where I should be. I should be over here. So, because we are ending. There's a great resource online called the Parthethelion. I'll type it into the chat there. If you look this up. If you Google the Parthethelion, it's a dictionary for all forms of Elvish. So if you type in a word, you'll get, if there are versions of it, in Quenya, Sindarin, Gnomish, Telerin, all those sort of different languages, So when I come up with Elvish, I usually use the Parthethelion as my resource and try to, make it as fair as Tolkien would. Anyway, guys, thank you for coming by. We had a lot of fun. I know we only got through 2 chapters, but we covered a lot of ground. Now the next, Limil is chain. You asked me because your name on the Discord is chain. You asked me what that is in Elvish. There's actually a few different words that could be chain. I chose Limil. Anyway, the next Tolkien stream, which should be as in 3 weeks on the 6th, the Council of Tolkien with myself and Matt and Sid, and it should be simulcast. It should be both on YouTube and Twitch at the same time. So, like I said, I'm going to put a call out on the Discord later to see if people are willing to be moderators on the YouTube end. I probably wouldn't need like a lot of them, maybe like just 2 people to keep an eye on things on that end ahead of that. And then the next one after that should probably be February the 20th. Now that is subject to change based on schedule demands and whatnot, but that should be the next Fellowship of the Ring reading analysis stream. So I'm going to end the recording section here and say goodbye to everybody watching on YouTube.